Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Wednesday, May 15th. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Asa Winstanley, Jon Elmer, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 222 of Israel's genocide in Gaza, and today is Nakba Day, when 76 years ago Israel declared itself a Western settler colonial state in Palestine and has been carrying out the Zionist project of ethnic cleansing every day since. Coming up in this broadcast, we'll have a discussion with Dr. Khaled Dawas, a British Palestinian surgeon who recently returned from working in Gaza. And of course, Jon Elmer will cover the fierce fighting in Rafah, Gaza City and Jabaliya, and he'll break down the combat videos that continue to demonstrate the capacity of the resistance to defend Gaza more than 6 months into the ground war. But first, some of the news over the last several days in Gaza. Israeli occupation forces pounded areas across the Gaza Strip this past week, from Jabaliya refugee camp and Gaza City in the north, where Israeli ground troops have re-entered, to Deir Balah in the central area, to Rafah in the south. This week alone, upwards of 450,000 people, which is 20% of the population in Gaza, have been displaced again from areas around Gaza, including at least 100,000 people in the north alone, as Israel issues new evacuation orders, according to the United Nations. Mahmoud Shalabi of the British charity Medical Aid for Palestinians stated on Monday that, quote, "We've been displaced again in the north of Gaza, from Beit Lahia to Gaza City this time. I've left my house several times now, along with my parents, both over 70, my 3 children, and my wife. The journey of terror and displacement is beyond words." The Rafah crossing at the Egyptian border remains closed for the 7th day in a row, preventing anyone from exiting or entering Gaza. In the north, Israel has subjected every area of Jabaliya to artillery bombardments and fire belts, quote, in an attempt to force out the local population, according to the Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor. The group stated on Tuesday that the Israeli military is systematically, quote, creating a coercive environment and repeatedly, violently, and directly bombing homes, residential neighborhoods, and shelter centers. The Israeli army has stormed United Nations-run schools, sheltering hundreds of displaced families in Jabaliya, killing and arresting dozens of them, the rights group added. The assault started on Saturday evening, May 11th, just a few hours after the Israeli army issued new evacuation orders against tens of thousands of people amid heavy air and artillery strikes, Euromed reports. The group's field team reported that a residential square in the Jabaliya camp was bombed by Israeli aircraft, while 6 UN schools inside Jabaliya camp, which housed thousands of displaced families, were besieged by Israeli forces. Quote, "The schools and their surroundings were targeted by artillery shelling and gunfire, including from quadcopter aircraft. Thousands had to escape under artillery fire and shelling before Israeli forces reached the schools, taking nothing with them but the clothes on their backs." Euromed added that at least 32 Palestinians inside Jabaliya were confirmed killed, along with additional victims who were sheltering inside the schools that Israeli forces stormed. Quote, "Dozens more were arrested, forced to remove their clothes, and tortured. Preliminary evidence suggests that at least one civilian, identified as Isa Hamouda from Jabaliya al-Balad, was tortured to death after his arrest." This is a video of the bombing of Jabaliya taken by local reporters.
على المنطقة التي نتواجد بها استهداف علينا استهداف علينا استهداف علينا استهداف علينا استهداف الذي وصلنا إليه الآن إلى محاولة استهداف على المكان الذي نتواجد به الآن أثناء محاولة الطواقم الطبية إجلاء المصابين والشهداء من المكان.
He was saying, yet another attack targets our vicinity as medical personnel try to evacuate both the wounded and the dead from the area. On Monday, Middle East Eye released this video of Palestinians fleeing intense Israeli bombing in Jabaliya.
تدار بركات الهواية يا الله يا الله. هذا المخيم الآن شظايا في كل مكان. هذه شظايا. تعال هيك تعال هيك يا الله. وضع خطير جدا في قلب المخيم. هاي يا الله. نحن الآن في قلب المخيم. القذائف تسقط من كل مكان علينا. تعال هيك تعال هيك تعال هيك. اوعوا تعال هيك. يا الله يا الله. وضع صعب جدا.
And earlier today, journalists filmed themselves being hunted by Israeli quadcopters in Jabaliya.
استهداف الآن علينا. صاروخ علينا الآن في قلب المكان. مسيرة إسرائيلية الآن. ننقل لكم المشهد. طائرة 𝐓𝐡𝐞 تقوم باستهدافنا بشكل مباشر. هذه هي الطائرة فوقنا تماما الآن. طائرة 𝐓𝐡𝐞 تعال أنا سنة تعال. هذا هو المشهد كما تشاهدون.
Our contributor Asil Musa, writing for Middle East Eye with reporter Hutifa Fayyad, reported that, quote, most people who fled Jabaliya and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 made it to western Gaza City, an area lacking basic infrastructure after months of Israeli attacks. The reporters add that, quote, ambulance workers said that they were fired at by Israeli drones in Rafah and northern Gaza in recent days, preventing them from carrying out their work. Journalist Hossam Shabat tweeted on Sunday that, quote, we thought the first days were the worst. Then we thought the starvation was the worst. But this bombing is like nothing we've seen. Today alone, Jabaliya refugee camp was bombed at least 100 times. Al Jazeera's reporter Muad Khalud filed this report from northern Gaza for the news agency on Sunday.
And this is one of the Israeli targets. He's about 15 years old, maybe. What's really shocking is there's about 11 persons still under the rubble so far.
We're shocked. We do not know what to do. We're physically and mentally worn out. We're on the verge of going insane. We've been under this hell for 8 months. Enough is enough. Look at this, garbage and debris. We're dying just to get our hands on some water or something to feed our children. This is not life. We struggle to get firewood and feed our starving children. And above all, the Israelis have been hitting us with missiles and bombs for months. What adds insult to injury is the recent warning. For God's sake, where do we go? Even Rafah is coming under attack. This is not life. Enough is enough.
We woke up in the middle of the night to a loud explosion. The whole building was leveled. We've been pulling the dead from under the rubble since then. This is a totally residential 6th-floor building with no presence of any resistance fighters. Nothing but women and children. More than 40 women and children were killed. All innocent, defenseless civilians. We pulled all these dead children as they were holding each other's hands. More children are still buried under the debris. All I can say is that may God punish those committing these crimes against innocent children.
That was Muad Khalud reporting for Al Jazeera on Sunday. The Palestinian rights group Al-Haq reported that Israeli forces launched a ground invasion in the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 neighborhood south of Gaza City on Thursday, following intense bombardment that targeted residential homes, streets, and agricultural lands. This marked the third incursion by Israeli forces into 𝐓𝐡 since last November, each time committing further atrocities of widespread destruction, killings, and displacement of residents, Al-Haq stated. On Saturday night, Israeli forces destroyed a municipal water tank in the Tel Al-Hawa area in Gaza City. The Gaza municipality stated on Sunday morning that, quote, the ongoing bombing has inflicted extensive and far-reaching destruction on water infrastructure since the beginning of the aggression and genocide. Approximately 40 wells have been damaged to varying extents along 42,000 linear meters of water pipelines. Gaza City is grappling with a critical water shortage due to limited fuel supplies and power outages essential for operating the water wells. In central Gaza, more than 30 Palestinians, most of them children, were killed when Israeli forces bombed a 3-story home in Nuseirat refugee camp that was sheltering 10 families on Monday, according to Gaza's civil defense. Israeli forces continued to bomb areas in Rafah in the south, where Israeli tanks have pushed deeper into the eastern parts of the city and bombed residential blocks. In Khan Yunis on Tuesday, activist Ahmed Madoun inspected U.S. President Biden's gifts to Israel left behind by Israeli soldiers.
I am now in the destroyed city, Khan Yunis, but I will show you something. These are the bombs that Israel used to kill our people and destroyed our cities. But look here, it's made in USA. So again, USA participated directly in this genocide. We will not forgive and we will not forget.
That was activist Ahmed Madoun. People who have fled over and over again to and from different areas of the Gaza Strip have been returning to United Nations schools in Khan Yunis in southeastern Gaza to try and seek shelter. The United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, released these photos on Saturday, saying, quote, the classrooms are torched, walls are blown out, there is rubble everywhere. The situation is unfolding under the world's watch. Enough is enough. The agency also released this video on Tuesday documenting how Palestinians are trying to seek basic necessities amidst Israel's destruction in Khan Yunis.
طبعا نزحنا من خان يونس على رفح وبعد تهديد الجيش الإسرائيلي لمدينة رفح رجعنا على خان يونس. طبعا لا يوجد أي بنية تحتية في خان يونس، البنية التحتية مدمرة بالكامل، لا يوجد أي خدمات، مياه، كهرباء، صرف صحي. من ضمن الأمور اللي بنعاني منها وموضوع المياه، الناس بتقف طوابير بالساعات، بنيجي احنا كل يوم هنا نمشي 2 و3 كيلومتر عشان نعبي قلنين، والقلنين هذول لا يكفي لسد احتياجات الأسرة.
نعبي نقف 3 ساعات بنيجي يمكن من بعد 2 كيلو نعبي ميه زي ما انتم شايفين طلع قديش نقف.
That was a video from UNRWA. In Rafah, Louise Wateridge, a communications officer with UNRWA, tweeted that families in Rafah have moved as far west as possible now, reaching the shore and along the beach. She added that people were awoken on Tuesday morning by Israeli Navy shelling, and that, quote, inland in Rafah is now a ghost town. It's hard to believe there were over 1 million people sheltering here just a week ago. Gaza's healthcare system is in shambles as ongoing closures at Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings prevent medications, supplies, and fuel, and as Israel orders doctors and staff to leave their hospitals. Medical staff at the Kuwaiti hospital in Rafah received an Israeli evacuation order on Monday. The British charity Medical Aid for Palestinians said, quote, this was one of the last remaining hospitals in Rafah and only had around 16 beds available for the more than 1 million people sheltering in the area. Quote, if the hospital is forced out of action, this could mean the complete collapse of the limited healthcare system in Rafah, the charity added, noting that the European Gaza hospital had run out of fuel as a result of Israel closing the crossings in southern Gaza, and after Israel cut off the supply of electricity to the territory in early October. As Israeli forces intensify their onslaught in Rafah, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, stated that it has been forced to stop providing healthcare at Rafah Indonesian Field Hospital. Quote, since Israeli forces have expanded their offensive in Rafah, it has become impossible to provide life-saving medical assistance amid a campaign of death and destruction, the medical organization said, adding that, quote, since October 7th, we have had to leave 12 different health structures and have endured 26 violent incidents, which include airstrikes damaging hospitals, tanks being fired at agreed deconflicted shelters, ground offensives into medical centers, and convoys fired upon. The Gaza Civil Defense reported on Sunday that while responding to a call in the Barazil refugee camp in Rafah, ambulance crews came under fire by Israeli quadcopter drones. The spokesman for the civil defense, Mahmoud Bassal, stated Sunday that, quote, there are no medical services or humanitarian aid provided to the displaced in the northern Gaza Strip. Bassal added that the amount of Israeli bombing and destruction is as incessant as the first days of the genocide, and that the Zionist occupation, quote, uses all possible means to kill Palestinian citizens. On Tuesday, the Palestine Red Crescent Society warned, quote, of the deterioration of humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip due to the continued closure of border crossings following the Israeli occupation forces' control and complete closure of the Rafah crossing. The Medical Association announced, notably, that they had reopened and restored operations in the ophthalmology, surgery, and orthopedics departments at Al-Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis, where the Palestine Red Crescent Society is headquartered. They said that these departments will supplement those previously reopened earlier this month after it had been completely closed due to the 40-day siege and occupation by the Israeli army in late March. Hind Kurari and Ryan Grimm of The Intercept reported yesterday that American doctors and nurses working inside Gaza, shoulder to shoulder with Palestinian physicians, have been told by the U.S. State Department and elected officials that efforts are underway to permit them to leave, even though the crossing remains sealed shut by Israel. Monica Johnston, one of the nurses at the European hospital in Khan Yunis, told The Intercept that medical staff are concerned that if they leave, the Israelis won't let replacements from other medical aid agencies to be allowed in, leaving the hospital campus, quote, more likely to get overrun by the Israeli military. The nurse told The Intercept that the plan is for the United Nations to do a test run from the European hospital to the Rafah border crossing in a vehicle carrying only UN staff. Quote, if those staff are not killed by the Israelis, as one international employee was on Monday, then 2 medical staff will be taken to the border and 2 new volunteers will be allowed in to replace them, and so on in the coming days. Many of the medical staff, she said, quote, despite themselves suffering from dehydration, vomiting, and diarrhea, are reluctant to leave without a guarantee that they can be replaced by new humanitarian aid workers. Meanwhile, Israel is continuing to target doctors, humanitarian aid workers, and cultural leaders. A 53-year-old employee of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Deir al-Balah, central Gaza, on Monday, after having fled Rafah. Our colleague Maureen Claire Murphy reports that his death brings to 189 the number of UNRWA staff killed in Gaza since October 7th. She adds that a United Nations safety and security staff member was killed and another severely injured when their UN vehicle came under fire while traveling, as I said, to the European Gaza hospital near Khan Yunis, north of Rafah, on Monday morning. For much more, read Maureen Claire Murphy's latest report, Israeli Attacks Newly Displace 1/5 of Gaza's Population, on electronicintifada.net. Israeli forces killed Dr. Mohammed Nemer 𝐄𝐥𝐞, one of the founders of pediatric surgery in the Gaza Strip, and his son Yusuf, a dentist, in an airstrike on their home on Saturday. And Hashem Ghazal, a leading member of Gaza's deaf community, was killed alongside his wife in an Israeli airstrike on Monday. A disability rights advocate, Ghazal worked closely with the Atfaluna Society for Deaf Children, a decades-old nonprofit that has been considered the main resource center for the deaf community in Gaza. �𝐤𝐈, a skilled carpenter, organized craft workshops for deaf kids and was known as Gaza's godfather of the deaf. 7 of �𝐤𝐈's children were severely wounded in the airstrike. This week, Israeli settlers laughed and cheered while destroying food and supplies on trucks at a checkpoint near Hebron in the occupied West Bank that were heading for Gaza. According to eyewitness accounts, settlers climbed onto the trucks and started dumping the parcels of food onto the ground while Israeli police stood by and watched.
תראו, חבר'ה פה, לא מפחדים, בחורות, בחורים, איזה יופי, עושים את המשאיות של החמאס, מקסימה, איזה יופי, תראו.
Then, about an hour later, according to reports, approximately 150 settlers, including children, arrived and destroyed what was left of the aid on the trucks. They were armed with knives and pieces of wood and threatened the Palestinian truck drivers. Some of the settlers reportedly set fire to one of the trucks. On Tuesday, in the town of Sderot, just north of Gaza, which was built on the ruins of the Palestinian village Najd, ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias on May 13, 1948, Jewish Zionist extremists on Tuesday held a festival calling for the resettlement of Gaza, while Israel carried out attacks just kilometers away inside Gaza in a particularly disturbing scene. The event was attended by Israel's National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who called for the forced expulsion of Palestinians in Gaza as part of the 76-year Israeli practice of violence, colonization, and displacement. Photojournalist Oren Ziv captured this video. Finally, we wanted to bring you some images and videos from journalists in Gaza and the West Bank who are not just relentlessly documenting the unspeakable atrocities, but also making sure to highlight the resilience, joy, and determination of the Palestinian people. This is a video of the Free Gaza Circus entertaining kids in Rafah this past week. Journalist Hamouda Shaheen in northern Gaza spoke to a woman older than the state of Israel itself. She explained why she won't leave Jabaliya.
من وجود الدبابات الإسرائيلية ومع تصاعد يعني القصف على مخيم جباليا هذه الثلة اللي رافضة تنزح وهذه الحجة ما شاء الله عليك يا حجة مالك مش طالعة الدبابات عندي
أنا مش خايفة أنا عمري 80 سنة بالحجر يا فداي بالحجر ونهدوا البيت بننام تحت الشجر
الله أكبر
والله ما أنا خايفين هذا مي معي وهذا بتكفينا 5 أيام
هذه الخبزة والمية 5 أيام
5 أيام
وأنت هنا بدك تحمي شو اسمه
وأنا بدي أحمي أرضنا وأحمي الشباب وأموت قبلهم
الله أكبر يا جماعة الخير لما نحكي عن حاضنة شعبية للجماعة هي الحاضنة الشعبية هذا المخيم دائما المعارك فيه مختلفة والأجواء فيه مختلفة عشان هيك هو صعب على الاحتلال الجميع هنا متوحد بصوت واحد وبقوة واحدة وبيرفض انه ينزح من المخيم الا اذا يعني صارت ساعة الصفر لكن حتى النفس الاخير في المخيم الاجواء مختلفة والظروف مختلفة.
And in the southern occupied West Bank village of Beit Awa, This week, a Palestinian decommissioned an Israeli spy drone with a well-thrown rock. Let's play that one again tomorrow. Thank you so much. And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza. And you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. Coming up, we'll get a full update from Jon Elmer, who will cover the fierce fighting in Rafah, Gaza City and Jabaliya, and break down the combat videos that continue to demonstrate the capacity of the resistance to defend Gaza more than 6 months into the ground war. But first, hi, Ali. How are you?
Hi, Nora. You know, it's always so difficult to listen to the news, and every part of it just hits you in the heart. But seeing the news about Hashim Ghazal of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 the charity in Gaza. I remember visiting 𝐓𝐡𝐞 when I was in Gaza. It's an institution that has done such important work for so many years. And we just, you know, it's impossible to hold in our heads and our hearts the scale of this genocide.
Yeah, indeed. It is impossible. We are just kind of left speechless day after day. But we wanted to bring on hopefully a new friend of ours, British Palestinian surgeon, Dr. Khaled Dawas. Dr. Khaled traveled to Gaza with medical aid for Palestinians to provide essential medical care at Al-Aqsa Hospital in Gaza. His first visit in January was followed by a second trip just a few months later. He just came back a few weeks ago. Dr. Khaled, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Nora. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Dr. Khaled.
Hi. It's good to have you. First off, your reaction to just in the last few days, the kind of escalation, if you can even call it that, of Israeli bombings, especially in northern and central Gaza, where you were working. What have you been watching closely?
It's interesting. Today, I was talking to a colleague of mine who's just come back more recently than I did from Gaza. He came back a week ago, and we were comparing notes. We were talking about how we react to noises and images that we see. And walking to work today, I heard a noise in the background. It was a sort of a loud banging noise. I didn't flinch, but in my mind, my response was, who's been hit? And he said exactly the same thing. We get conditioned to these things. So looking at the pictures and the news that we watch nowadays, I think it was expected. We knew, if you'd asked me 2 months ago, 3 months ago, when all the talk about not going into Rafah because the American administration was pushing the Israelis not to do so, I think we knew that was ultimately going to happen, because that was the stated aim from the beginning, and it would be politically suicidal for the Israeli government not to do so. Nevertheless, though we expected it, we all feel the pain of people living there. I have the added guilt of knowing that colleagues of mine are still there, and I could leave. I was in touch with one of the doctors at the Kuwaiti hospital soon after the more concerted effort on attack on Rafah happened, because we know that Rafah has been hit every day since the beginning, and he's a particularly resilient man who, back in October, sent me the voice message which told me that he'd received the first threat by the Israeli forces to get out of the hospital and to clear the hospital. This was back in October, and I remember the panicked message that I got from him, and I also was very panicked, and we tried to get people together to try and, in the hope that some pressure would work. Now, whether that pressure did eventually come up with a result or not, ultimately at that time there was no attack on that particular hospital, but we know that since then the Yusuf al-Najjar hospital in Rafah and the Kuwaiti hospital, let me always just qualify the Kuwaiti hospital, what the Kuwaiti hospital is, because I went to see the Kuwaiti hospital in January. The Kuwaiti hospital is a 15 bedded unit, which has 2 operating theaters, no intensive care, no CT scanners, and had the sign that I famously, for myself, display when I sometimes talk, which says "La hafadat, la fawat," and which means no pampers and no, they call it bambers, in fact, not hafadat, and no female hygiene products. That was where I took that photograph from back in January. So it's inevitable, but nevertheless, you feel that anger and sadness that we all feel. I do feel very strong that we have to still maintain the sense of resilience, because we carry that sense of resilience from us in Gaza. When I went in Gaza, that was a message: don't forget us, and don't let the overwhelming sadness and grief become the dominant theme that we have in our response.
Dr. Khaled, you were in Gaza in January, and you went back you went back again a few months later, and you just came back in mid-April. So you've been to Gaza twice in the space of a few months during this genocide. I want to ask you to talk about where you were in Gaza in terms of the different hospitals and the differences you saw in terms of the different locations and in terms of between January and April. How had things changed?
If I take you, Ali, on a trip from Rafah to where we were, Deir al-Balah, which is in the middle of Gaza. So the trip we took back in January started off going from the crossing, which is now closed and partially destroyed at least, through Rafah, which was very busy back in January. So this is December now. We actually got into Gaza on December the 26th after a day's delay in Egypt. And we drove from the crossing to Rafah city center on our way to what was at the time our house in Khan Yunis, and it was very crowded. We had to divert the route that we were taking because of the crowds in the roads. And then this was my first exposure to Gaza in that instance, and I remember very clearly being astonished by the number of people in the streets, people on donkey carts. There were some cars driving around, and people carrying the raw materials for their tents. They were carrying the pieces of wood, they were carrying the plastic, and then you could see people setting them up. I saw a barber who would set up shop in one of the corners just outside a wall. And that took us a good part of an hour to get out of Rafah and then get to Khan Yunis. That road beyond Rafah to Khan Yunis was fairly rural. I mean, I would describe it accurately as a rural road at that time. And we stayed in a house in an area called Al-Mawasi, which is to the west of Khan Yunis, which is the so-called designated safe area. And then that house subsequently, by the way, got hit by the Israeli Air Force a week after we left it. And there was a second team in there when they got hit. And we received via the two charities I went with, MAP and the IRC, 6 different explanations as to why that house was hit. Then the route from Khan Yunis and Mawasi to the hospital, again, was fairly rural until you hit Deir al-Balah camp. Deir al-Balah camp is on the coast. That sort of segment of about 1 kilometer was extremely crowded. It would take us another 20 minutes just to get to 1 kilometer, and then we would turn right heading east towards the hospital, just beyond Deir al-Balah camp. And that route was very busy. Outside the hospital was extremely crowded. The road, the last 200 meters, were probably the most crowded bit. People walking around. There were some stalls on the side, people sort of selling whatever there was to sell at the time. And then the grounds of the hospital were packed with tents from the outside. And the hospital itself was full to the rim with people lying on the floor. And I remember very clearly the people lying on the beds, in between the beds, on the floor. And the carers were the families mainly, because there weren't enough staff. Now, the difference back in April was that when we drove, we stayed in Rafah for the first night in April. And we decided that the journey from the house to the hospital was the most risky part of the journey, if not just for us, but also for our colleagues who were providing the logistics, our transport to the hospital. So we decided to stay in the hospital. This time around, the road from Rafah to Deir al-Balah was absolutely full to the rim with tents and people, and you couldn't see the sea. The sea from the road is probably about 100, 200 meters at most. We could not see the sea because of the tents. So that was a very dramatic difference. Deir al-Balah was a little bit quieter because people had moved south at that point. We left Deir al-Balah in January after the hospital was hit with a missile that went through the wall. So that was the beginning of people moving further south. And we know after we left in January, there were more hits on the area around Deir al-Balah, including Nusayrat and Maghazi and Zawaida and the rest of them.
Dr. Khaled, can you talk a little bit about your specialty and what kind of daily life was like as a surgeon working in these conditions, and maybe talk about some of the patients, some of the families that you met and treated.
Yeah, I often remember them now, and I get a bit emotional talking about some of these sometimes. I have to sort of gather myself. In January, my field is gastrointestinal surgery. My regular work in the UK, I deal with abdomen and thoracic surgery, chest surgery, because of my subspecialty, which is dealing with esophagus surgery and stomach. So I have the skills and the confidence to deal with surgery within the chest and the abdomen, and that's what I did on both occasions. And I'd say the vast majority of my work was dealing with abdominal injuries, but also quite a lot of work in the chest. And the vast majority were due to shrapnel injuries. But then we had days where you had clusters of bullet injuries. And why that would happen was, my interpretation was that you would have things like quadcopters hovering in a particular area, and they would be firing bullets. And what appeared to be fairly random, because people who were coming in were all ages, women and men, and there was no particular clustering of a particular type of human target, to put it bluntly. So the kind of memorable things I have, the memorable stories I have from January, which were mirrored and amplified in April, were particularly some of the injuries which were new to me. I mean, they were new to me in December, January, because I hadn't dealt with what shrapnel does to you. Shrapnel defined as anything that flies as a result of an explosion, which causes debris of any sort to fly in a very fast direction, and very fast, very quickly, but also very hot items, piercing people's bodies and causing indiscriminate and unpredictable injuries. And as soon as it hits someone's body and pierces the muscle and the skin, it goes in a direction which is unpredictable. So you end up with the insides of somebody being torn to shreds, because you can't tell that from the outside. We didn't have scanners in Deir al-Balah, in Al-Aqsa hospital in January. We had a head scan only that worked, and for body scanning we didn't have. So you had to make your decision based on your clinical judgment and what you think was the mechanism of injury and where they were, and what perhaps their relatives and their friends told us had happened at the spot. So we were dealing with a lot of fairly blind approach to surgery to try and salvage, save, and help as many people as we could. And I remember particularly one very bad morning. It was just after New Year's Day, and we went down to the emergency department and saw three. We saw one particular. There was one boy who had his head wrapped in some dressing with a ventilator, and he was probably about, I'd say, 12, 13 years old. But we discovered then that he was dying because he had a severe head injury, and there was nothing we could do about it. There was no service to save his life. But at the same time, we found the boy sitting outside, lying unconscious, but breathing in the reception area. And we discovered that he had a pretty big injury in his lungs. We could see his lungs through his skin. And we moved him quickly, the team I was with and we moved him to the resuscitation area. But to move him there were no beds. We had to move that boy who was dying on the ventilator off the bed onto the floor and put him on the bed. And we had to deal with his chest injuries, but also at the same time, his sister, who was 7 years old and a bit older than him, happened to be on the floor in agony, screaming in agony because her leg was broken. And we had to later on straighten that leg without any anesthesia. So I remember looking up from that scene and just taking a picture in my own mind for a picture of what I was seeing and the implications of what I was seeing for these people. And this was a recurring theme. I was seeing this one day. The people working there and the people living there were seeing this constantly. Moving to April, I went back and I I had regretted after January that I did not record people's names and stories in a more, because I felt I was obliged, when I thought about it, when I came back, to amplify their stories. They have no voice, these people in Gaza. And it was one of my missions, not just to go as a clinician, but also to go and amplify their voice and for people to hear what their stories are. And I only took first names for obvious reasons, but I have so many stories. I mean, when I went to Gaza in April, I took a book with me called I Am Pilgrim, which you might be familiar with, a very big, chunky fiction book. I could write 2 books like that on the experiences I've had in Gaza. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of stories, perhaps in April. Of course, we focus on children a lot. We all, people do, because it's the most obvious story that pulls at people's heartstrings, and I'm all for that. But we can't also forget their parents, their sisters and their brothers who are older than them, and their grandparents who are also dying and being injured and mutilated in large numbers. And I remember on the 7th of April, I was asked to see a girl, a 17-year-old girl called Lemma. Lemma was there with her father, and it turns out later on that she was the only child for her parents. And she'd had a shrapnel injury, she'd had abdominal surgery, but she had to go back to theater because, as happens with shrapnel, you don't find everything on the spot. You often find you operate on them. 2 days later, something else happens. Something else declares itself, which you hadn't picked up because you just couldn't see it. So she needed to go back to see a surgeon, and I took her back to surgery myself and operated on her, and she had an operation which involved removing some more bowel and also bringing out what's called a colostomy, where you empty your bowels in a bag. And this is a 17-year-old girl. And we operated on her, and her father, I remember, extremely caring, very intense man who we had to ask to calm down at times because he was very intense and understandably so. Now, I kept seeing her pretty much nearly every day until I left Gaza on the 15th of April. And I asked my colleague who's going in there to keep an eye on her, and we took some instruments, some equipment to help with her care afterwards. And then as they were leaving in early May, I got a text from her aunt, who I kept in touch with, and said to me, Lemma just passed away this morning. Very upsetting. And it took me a while. I remember where I was when I got that message. And it gives you a sense of hopelessness because you do these things. And despite all the work that one can do medically, and not just me individually, this is not about me, but it's the hopelessness of people who go through these injuries and yet come out of it with some hope. But that hope is dashed away, not just because they live where they are, but because actually the injuries that they get are so serious. And it's the only fault they have is either because their age. I mean, young men are being targeted in a horrendous way. The number of men I saw, young men who is just unbearable to see, because and their only fault is they happen to be men between the ages of 16, 17, and 25, who happen to be with their families, and they are targeted because they are young men. So these are stories which I will, they will live with me forever, and I owe it to them to kind of keep these stories alive.
Yeah, it must just be impossible doing your best with the resources that you have, as surgeons, as medics, as nurses, as physicians, emergency room doctors, and they just keep coming, and it won't stop, and the world won't stop it. Can you talk about how your colleagues are doing right now? The ones that you work very closely with, who are in, these hospitals that are receiving evacuation orders, that at the same time that they're receiving dozens of injuries, from, children to elders. What are you hearing from your colleagues?
So I hear the stories from Deir al-Balah, from the Aqsa hospital, and I also hear the stories from Rafah, from particularly the Kuwaiti hospital. And I've got some colleagues who are working in the European hospital. Those are probably the three main hospitals left. And I just reiterate the fact that the Kuwaiti hospital is not a proper trauma hospital. This is a glorified surgical practice. And the doctors in Deir al-Balah particularly I got to know them very well. I spent days working with them, weeks working with them, but also I spent a lot of time talking to them when we weren't operating. A very resilient bunch of people. Of course, they're humans. They lose it. They're less patient than they were in January. They are more on edge than they were in January, but some of them have had to move homes multiple times. So they've got to think about their families. And one particular doctor who I'm very fond of, he acts as the head of the surgical department at Al-Aqsa Hospital, a very patient man who I used to walk around with. And despite him doing this now pretty much day in, day out for, at the time, 7 months, when people grab him, as they do, as you walk into the hospital, people grab you because they want your attention. They want you to answer their questions. They want you to ask you about their relative or themselves. And it's very intense. Meters without someone grabbing you because they want to ask you something. And he would always have the time to listen and reply and smile, and then he would walk away. We'd walk away, he'd smile at me, and we'd smile at each other because we acknowledge the need, the desperation of people there. He told me one day as we were, in fact, he told me several times the same story. He talked about his son, who is a 17-year-old boy who was just about to finish high school this year and go to university. And his son is extremely depressed that now he feels his future is lost. Of course, we hope it's not lost, and I really pray it's not lost. And when this is over, there'll be lots of people who want to make sure that this is the case. But he was depressed, and he was having a tough time with his dad, because he feels that his dad should have looked after them better. Of course, we all know that is not possible. It's beyond his control. But his father, my colleague, felt extremely guilty about this, and was asking me rhetorically, "What do I do with my children? The eldest I have is 17. The youngest the other ones are all in school. We have no schools left. What's going to happen to them?" So these doctors have to live with this in the background. The worry that when they leave home and go to hospital, they may not go and find their homes when they go back home. This was communicated to me several times by my other colleagues. So they carry on, and part of them carrying on is also them not wanting to take a break and sit at home and worry about what could happen to them when they're at home. So I tried to convince him that one of the reasons we were there in Gaza was to give them relief. And that was genuinely my belief, that we were there so that they could go home and have a break. But they don't want to have a break, because having a break, well, there's no such thing as a break. They're sitting there with bombardments and stories of misery and destruction and death all around them. They'd rather be busy, feeling that they can do something productive. And there are doctors who feel, particularly the younger ones, who have aspirations, have futures that they worry about, their careers, their progression, their education, their training. Many of them, and I'm still in touch with them, who ask me, can I come and finish my training in the UK? Or are there any options for me to go outside, and can you help with that? And many of them want to go back to Gaza, and I believe they do. But they know that there is going to be a big problem for the next few years as to how they finish their training, their careers, and how they progress and become the people that they want to be. They have aspirations. These are very ambitious people. I chair a charity called 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿, which deals with medical schools in Palestine. I know what they're like. I've interviewed many of these students, spoken to them. I've gone to visit them during exams, and I know what they're like. So their aspirations and their wishes and their ambitions to improve themselves and come back are genuine. But what's going to happen for the next few years, when I hope most of them will survive, because some of them, we have lost some of them were also included in the group of people who were imprisoned. They were taken by the Israeli forces out of Al-Shifa and Nasser complex and put in prisons, and I met some of them. I've seen some of them. They have a very difficult time coming psychologically to terms with what's going on.
Dr.
Go ahead.
Dr. Khaled, listening to you is unbearable. And going through what you've been through and bearing witness to what people in Gaza are going through must be infinitely more so. So I'm not sure what I have to add except to say thank you for going and for bearing witness and for telling the story of Lama, of her family. And I think about your colleague, I don't know if you know him personally, Dr. Hasan Nasrallah, who was in Gaza for 43 days and came out and has been doing exactly what you're doing now, which is telling the stories, bearing witness to what he saw, which is, I think, as important as the healing work you do. And I don't want to underestimate that. I think educating the world is as important. And as you will know, he was slapped with a ban by Germany, which effectively banned him from entering most of the EU. And that was just overturned yesterday in a court. I mean, I just want to ask you to reflect on the perversity of silencing doctors who are witnesses to genocide in a continent which proclaims itself to be founded on the ashes of the Holocaust and on learning the lessons of never again. And I want to ask you what reactions you've been having since you came back and have been talking about what you witnessed in Gaza and the people that you worked with, the people that you treated, the people that you lived with.
Ali, I mean, I do a lot of thinking about this. I find it impossible to understand how anybody who is willing to open their eyes and go and see, if they can, go and see Gaza, to have any other opinion about what's going on. Hasan I know well, and Hasan I admire very much for what he does, not just clinically, but also for what he stands for and his willingness to speak up. And the only explanation I have is that there is so much fear that talking about the truth of what's happening is difficult to deal with from those who oppose what Hasan and others are saying, because the reality is very obvious. I mean, when people ask you, and historically we all know, but those of us who've spoken about Palestine for many years, and you talk about it gingerly, because people say, well, it's complicated. It's not. We know it's not complicated at all. There's no complication there at all. It's very, very simple. It's about a story about occupiers and people who are resisting occupation. There's nothing simple. There's nothing complex about it at all. And it takes someone to go out there and see it for themselves, and then say, as I've often heard, I could not believe that this would actually be happening, because it's incredulous. It's a story which is made of fiction. It's not something that you would imagine people doing, as is happening by Israeli occupation. So I've met people, many of them colleagues, but also previous mentors of mine who've done the same thing. And they were said to me, I went there, I just had to go there once and see what it was like. And I'm talking about 15 years ago, not even now, for them to realize what the real story is. So I mean, my only attempt to maintain sanity in my own mind as to how anybody could see that there are two sides to the story of the genocide that's going on is go and see for yourself. Of course, nobody, you can't go for yourself, because even in inverted commas peaceful times, entry into Gaza is controlled by Israel. Even nowadays, I can only get into Gaza because 𝐄𝐥𝐿, the Israeli authorities, will allow me to go into Gaza, and my movement in Gaza is coordinated with them. It's perverse, it's ridiculous, and the fact that those in authority feel that this is normal begs many, many questions about people's sanity.
And now that you're back in the UK, are you able to speak with people in government, in parliament, and have the media been interviewing you? I mean, is anyone listening?
People are listening. I think people are genuinely more interested now. I think more and more people are realizing that what's going on is madness, and that the story is trickling out. I do take hope in the fact I sort of have some optimism, because what the people I'm talking to more and more are a wider cohort of people. They're not the same usual, the kind of, to overuse that phrase about echo chambers that we're in.
Hope that connection will come back.
Yeah. Seems to be, oh no.
Hopefully it will come back. While we're working on that, I just want to clarify something, because I saw people asking about it. The ban on Dr. Hasan Abu-Sittah was overturned by a court. It wasn't actually lifted voluntarily by the German government. And Dr. Abu-Sittah, as a result of this ban, he was actually banned from entering Germany on April 12th, when he was planning to attend a conference in Berlin on Palestine. I was invited to the same conference, and the German police raided it and shut it down within an hour of it opening. I didn't travel to Germany. I was supposed to join it by video, but they even prohibited that, and they banned Dr. Hasan Abu-Sittah, the British Palestinian surgeon. And the day before he was banned from entering Germany, he was inaugurated as rector of Glasgow University, where he was elected with 80% of the votes on a record turnout, which again shows how the student body values the work he does. But the ban imposed by the Germans affected him. He wasn't able to enter France or the Netherlands either. And just yesterday, his lawyers from the European Legal Support Center and the international, it's in this article that I wrote earlier today, I forget the name of the organization, they managed to get a German court to overturn the ban. So I don't know if we're able to get
I think he's back. Yes.
Okay, great.
Hi,
Wonderful.
Dr. Khaled. That's okay. I wanted to ask you finally, a lot of people in the comments are saying, I don't know how, how he does it, or, what it's like, having to live with these nightmares and over again of seeing people, knowing, that there, if this, that it didn't have to happen, that Israel has been doing this for 76 years, and it's not stopping. What keeps you going? How do you, like, what's the motivation for you to keep going, not just going to Gaza and working there, but also coming back home and telling these stories?
I think two things, Nora. I think if I was to try and contextualize it in my own mind, try and bring some kind of understanding to my simple thinking about how this can be, and how does one accept it and live on accepting that this is going on not far from where I am, in relative terms, is that first of all, I think about the small aspects of it, the individual differences. That yes, I completely recognize that I and many others who have gone to Gaza, I'm not the only one, there are many others like me who've gone to Gaza and probably been even more helpful than I have been. And that is that you touch individual people's lives, and you hope that one individual person somehow gets amplified, and they happen to be somebody that can do something later on. And this is whether you do it out in Gaza or whether I do it here in the UK by speaking to you and others about it. I'm hoping that somebody listening, maybe not directly, but they pass on that message, and then the next person can do something. And that amplification, that cascade effect, will one day have an effect. And I hope it's soon. I do hope it's in my lifetime. And I do genuinely believe with optimism that will happen. And overall, in the kind of bigger picture of things, I think, and this is why it's important to speak out and be clear about this, is that I'm a very big believer in history. We know history, these things don't last forever. Such injustices, such extremes of behavior and cruelty do not last forever. And one day we'll look back, again, I hope it's in my lifetime, but maybe not. But if we look back and say, this is where it all started, and things change. It took a while because we're as human beings, we have a relatively short, finite lifespan, and then you've got to look at the bigger picture. What will happen in 100 years' time or 200 years' time when we look back and say, was this the spark that created the change that was required? Now, I know that is not a huge amount of comfort for people who are suffering through this at the moment. And that's the bit that's really difficult to come to terms with, because you can't change the suffering enough. You can do individual acts of kindness, but do they affect the large population? No, they don't. And this is me going back to saying, what I do over there, or what doctors that go out there, we are providing only a drop in the ocean of need. That is the need in Gaza at the moment. But that's where I go back again and say, you hope that spark creates something else, which becomes a tipping point. And that's how I think about it.
And if those of us in our audience who are not doctors feel like, what they're doing isn't enough, and I'm speaking for myself as well, there's all this feeling of like, even though we're doing what we can, it feels like it's not enough. What do you say? What's your advice?
I say we all feel the same way, whether we can go or not. This is a kind of, it really is a living nightmare of all of ours, that we feel we're not doing enough. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, my own interpretation, my own thoughts, I feel that the speaking out is much more important than going to Gaza and visit. The importance, I think, of going to Gaza for me was, yes, doing the clinical work, helping with some of the operations. And as I say, it's a drop in the ocean. But actually, I feel it's more the listening to their stories and showing them that we have not forgotten them. Their biggest worry was abandonment and being forgotten. And us being there and telling them about what's happening outside, like in the UK and the US, around the world, is such a revitalizing message that they, and I do not exaggerate when I say I've seen people with tears in their eyes from me just saying to them, no, we haven't forgotten about you. And there are these things happening out there in the world. And there's a lot of support for you, but we just haven't got to the point of convincing those in authority to do so, but it's getting there. And that voice is so important. So please don't feel this is hopeless. And I've said this to so many people here who say the same thing to me. I wish I could go and help. Yes, that would be great, but many of us can't. Most of us can't. And your voice makes a massive difference. And it's not just a cliche.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Khaled Dawas. We know that you work with the British charity Medical Aid for Palestinians. The other one, was it FQMS?
So FQMS is the educational medical school education charity, and I went with MAP and also the International Rescue Committee. They were the ones that organized our trip to Gaza.
Wonderful. So if people want to learn more about the work that those organizations do, they can check out Medical Aid for Palestinians, the International Rescue Organization,
Committee and FQMS. Yeah.
And FQMS. Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Khaled Dawas. We'd love to have you on again to talk about your work.
Darling.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khaled. It was really tough, but important to listen to you, and I hope many people will have a chance to hear what you have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Ooh, that was tough. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. Let's bring on Jon. There's an extra long resistance report today. Hi, Jon.
Hi, guys. That was a great interview.
Hi, Jon. Yeah.
And your news report is always really important, Nora. I commend you for going through that, and it's absolutely necessary to get. And I know that it's difficult. I'm going to try and bring some inspiration here in the second half of the show.
Let's go for it.
Yeah, let's go for it. We're going to cover the resistance in Gaza from the very southern point, southeast Rafah, all the way to the north in Jabaliya. So we'll just show you a map here so people can get a sense. The map on the left there, that's Rafah in red. That's the area. Well, Rafah is all across the bottom of that map. The blue is the area where the Israeli military has pushed in. That is mostly not built up area. It's farm field. And it's, of course, the Rafah crossing is now closed, as Nora reported. But they're pushing in on the eastern edge of Rafah. And on the map on the right, you could see 𝐓𝐡𝐞 corridor dividing the Gaza Strip. There's reports today that the Americans are going to be attaching the pier at the end of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 corridor in the next 24 hours. Believe it when I see it. But that's the plan. And then there's fighting in 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in Gaza City, the third invasion of 𝐓𝐡𝐞. The Israelis keep saying they win, and then they keep having to go back in and fight. And they've been fighting for the last week in 𝐓𝐡𝐞. They left 𝐓𝐡𝐞 today. And then there's major fighting in Jabaliya in the camps and in the city of Jabaliya on the eastern edge of Jabaliya, all the way out to the border is fierce fighting that's been happening. And this is all in the context. I always want to do this before I get into the resistance, is just to underline the humanitarian catastrophe that we're witnessing. 500,000 people on the move under conditions that are much more difficult than when they moved the first time in October and November, when we called it a virtual death march because of how brutal the march was for people to walk those tens of kilometers to the new place where they were going to set up. In some cases, Khan Yunis, in some cases, Rafah. But this time we're adding the ruins. They have to move through the ruins, the famine that is gripping Gaza. Just basic things like dehydration and exhaustion make it really difficult to pack up your cloth and wood tent and carry it with your family aged, 2 to 80 years old. And people are injured. There's a catastrophic level of serious injuries in Gaza, more than 100,000 people with serious injuries. And so this is just really devastating, this attack on Rafah and the moving of 1.5 million, 1.4 people, 700,000 children out of Rafah into where? The ruins of Khan Yunis, the packed middle camps there where you see Deir al-Balah. There's no room in these places for people to set up. This is just a catastrophe. And it's a systematic genocide that we have been covering every day now we're into the 8th month. Israel carries out 150 airstrikes a day right now, tens of thousands of artillery shells, and that's the context within which the resistance takes place. So let's look at number one, because we watched last week the Israelis mustering on the border. Qassam hit them with rockets, mass casualty event at their staging area outside of Rafah. This is IDF footage showing us those tanks that were stationed in that staging area beginning the move into Rafah. Interestingly, though, they have split themselves off. The divisions that were positioned to go into Rafah, only one of the divisions went in, and the other two divisions moved up into the north. They moved into 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and they moved into Jabaliya. So while the U.S. is still talking about the Rafah invasion as separate from what we're seeing in Rafah right now, it is possible that what the Israelis are saying it's a precise operation, a precise raid, rather than the takeover and attempted occupation of Rafah, which would require a force posture that we're not seeing right now from the Israelis. That can always change very quickly. That division from 𝐓𝐡𝐞 can move down. But Rafah is a logistically challenging place for Israel to occupy in comparison to the other places in Gaza that they've been fighting so far. There's a long border with Egypt. It's more than twice the width of anywhere else in Gaza. That stretches supply lines for the Israelis, stretches their supply lines. Rafah is a spread out, sprawling town. And so there's a lot of ground to cover. And so here we see these tanks. They're moving in on the eastern edge of Rafah. And immediately we got a flood of resistance reports. 30 resistance reports on the first day. That's more reports than at any time since December, when there was a full-scale war all over the Gaza Strip. And every day since then, the number has increased. And so the resistance is showing the capacity to not only continue to fight, but actually to escalate that fight. And each day escalate from the day before, let alone escalating from the 7 months of ground war that we've been witnessing. So those are important things to point out, because as soon as these tanks arrived, we see a fighter here emerging from a tunnel right in the area that we saw those tanks. We see a Namr troop carrier that doesn't have an active protection trophy system to defend itself. And you see a Yasin strike from a Qassam shooter who emerges from the ground and hits directly on the troop carrier. These kind of tunnel operations, we're going to see them throughout this show. And it's one of the reasons why when the war started, the Israelis said there was 500 kilometers of tunnels. And then as the war carried on, they said there was 700 kilometers of tunnels. And now I heard on the BBC, the IDF said yesterday that there's 1,000 kilometers of tunnels, because these tunnels are in their nightmares. Everywhere they go, fighters pop up, can hit them, and then return to their bases safely. These are not martyrdom missions, as I've pointed out throughout this war. These operations are carried out by fighters who are returning to their bases with the skill set, with the experience to carry on the fight. And we're seeing that. We've seen that all through the war. So we'll just watch this one last. Okay, we'll go to this one, because there's so many today, guys. We have to keep them moving. So this is in Rafah. We're going to watch a cameraman and a shooter moving through their neighborhood. The Rafah brigade has been waiting for 7 months for this battle. They're prepared for it. They know the area. They know the terrain. They can set up minefields. They can set up frontline defenses. They can set up shooting positions like this. This is their neighborhood. They know the landscape. And that is a major advantage for the guerrillas at all times. This is a tank being hit with, apparently has a command flag on that tent, on that tank. You could see it at the top of that one. So you could see them just moving through, again, carefully moving through the undergrowth, tight to the buildings. We're still seeing the fighters being extremely careful of the drones that are in the air constantly. And knowing the landscape in their own neighborhoods allows them to get around, to get shots like this at a distance there that we watched it hit that Namr troop carrier from a distance that's too close for the active protection system to properly kick in. So this is the third one against the tank. And you can see that's often that flag is a command flag or some sort of flag signaling a lead tank in a convoy. And then you see the fighter return to his base through the tunnel at the end of that clip there. So if we go to number 2, this is a Qassam fighter in a tunnel here. They're going to fire on this troop position. The Israelis move into the troop position. Qassam has surveillance right on top of them, literally in the next building. The Israelis believe that building is safe, and they get a thermobaric warhead from a Yasin targeting him. And this fighter says, he salutes his commanders and he says, "We say to Netanyahu, who promises to enter Rafah, we are here waiting for you, preparing for you many varieties of your death. This is just the tip of the iceberg. A short while ago, we hit a special force squad in a building, the one we just saw. And now we will hit a Merkava tank." And here they go, as promised, hitting the Merkava tank. That's actually a Namr troop carrier, but he could be forgiven for that. But just like he said in the tunnel, calling his shot. And this is the first day that the Israelis are inside Rafah, feeling the resistance in Rafah that has been laying in wait for them for 7 months for this battle. If we go to number 4, we have a variety of, as he said, a variety of death options This is Qassam machine gun fire at another Israeli troop position that's right across the street. So they have surveillance on the building right across the street. And we could see machine gun fire. We pull out the audio always of these videos, but heavy machine gun fire, which is something we haven't actually seen tons of in these videos. The videos often take, we see sniper rifles, but this kind of small arms fire and PK machine gun fire isn't something we see all the time. So it's interesting to see it in Rafah in the first stages of the battle, because these are obviously fighting positions that they knew the Israelis were going to come into, and they have all different types of operations prepared for them in these areas. And you can see the emptying of the clip there. And in number 6, we were watching a mortar team here operating, and this fighter also has a message. He's got his hand on his heart, and he says, "From under the bullets and the sounds of planes and cannons, we send 2 messages. A message of a threat and a message of steadfastness. The message of a threat is to Netanyahu and his forces. As for the message of steadfastness, it is to our people, our loved ones, to our nation who are displaced from their homes and suffering hardships. My message to you is to be steadfast, to be patient and persevere, because as you sacrifice, we also sacrifice in the name of the homeland." This is them saying what they've said throughout the war, that we fight in the same trench as our people. And he's very eloquently making this point while under drone surveillance, getting ready to launch his Qassam makes 3 mortars, 60 millimeter, 81 millimeter, and 120 millimeter mortars. He looks like he's got 81 millimeter mortars there. But sending a message to his people, something that we see in these videos, and I always pull the videos where they have these messages to their people, because I think that it shows the many layers of complexity of the national liberation struggle. They obviously make these statements for a reason. And so although the mortar teams get sort of short shrift in these video reports, because there's a lot of them, and all you can really see them do is load it and fire. And so whenever there is more reports from the field, I always cut the mortar teams out of them and the rocket teams out of them. And as I've said before, I'll have to apologize to the artillery units, because they're the core part of this battle. All throughout, they have been since the year 2000, when these mortar teams were critical to the anti-settlement strategy that Qassam carried out to attack with mortars the Israeli settlements inside Gaza and Israeli army positions inside Gaza, in order to ultimately drive them out of Gaza in 2005, as the Israelis did the so-called disengagement, where they uprooted their settlements and pulled their settlers and soldiers out of Gaza. So that was 7 mortar teams right there operating. And a few hours later, the IDF acknowledged 8 casualties from mortar fire on the Rafah crossing, where the Israelis are blocking the crossing. 2 Yahalom special forces soldiers were killed in those mortar attacks. And now we have the one everyone was waiting for, I think. This is number 37 here tomorrow. We're watching an unbelievable complex ambush here. We're watching 3 fighters emerge from a tunnel in the middle of an IDF base where they believe that they're safe. We're seeing 2 Shawad EFPs, explosively formed penetrators, devastating anti-tank weapons. We're watching him come out of the tunnel 10 feet away from the tank, picks up his Shawad, carries it directly to the tank. Now they're showing us the second fighter emerging from the same tunnel with his Shawad. And watch this. You can see an Israeli soldier right there. So he walks in behind the soldier, and then he's right there at the back door of the Merkava tank. And you can see the distance that he places it at. He's placing it at that distance so that the shape charge of the explosively formed penetrator has time to fully form and hit. So what we're watching is brave, but we're watching something that is complex, it's tight, it's precise, and it's executed perfectly by the fighters. So yes, it's brave. A lot of comments about various body parts of steel these guys have. But really, if you watch this operation, when it loops back around, that's the medevac helicopter taking them wounded away. Everybody's wounded. The Israelis never say anyone dies. But watch this. They come out of the tunnel in the middle of the base. One guy he knows exactly where he's going. He's not putting this in some random spot. He's not pointing it at the tank in any different place. He knows when he emerges from this tunnel that he is going to go to the back door of the first Merkava tank, the second 𝐄𝐥𝐿 carrier. He's aiming it at the armored personnel carrier. You can see him there. He just got up from the tunnel and he's picking up the device. He walks it directly to the back door. He doesn't place it on the side where there's also vulnerabilities. The weakest point of the armor on the tank is the back door. It's also where the soldiers are inside. You blow that door off and you have a crew of 4 and probably 4 other infantry soldiers in the tank at any given time. And then you see a third guy who comes up with a Yasin 105 and fires it at the Namr troop carrier on the other side. Each person knows when they come up that tunnel, what move, what decision, where they're going. We'll watch it one more time just because there's so many things to point out in this. You can watch on this next time through the ability to get up through this tunnel. That tunnel is dug despite the fact that the Israelis have tilled that soil, turned it all up, believing that they have covered over and can put their vehicles there because they've buried the tunnels. But it's actually the opposite. They loosen the till and it makes it easier for the fighters to emerge from their tunnel spot. The tunnels have offensive tunnels, defensive tunnels, strategic tunnels, logistics tunnels, and the difference of them is by closing a door. And so when these fighters, let's focus now on their return to the tunnel, because these fighters are, again, returning to their base safely. So he sets the device, pulls the pin there. He's got something like 6 seconds. We take out the audio, but it goes off. The second guy pulls his, the third shooter comes out, and then all 3 of them pile down into the tunnel, and there they are walking away under the tunnel. And you can hear in the audio of this video, if you go to my Twitter account, the full videos are there. You can hear the audio in the video. You could hear the second 𝐄𝐥𝐿 explode as they're underneath the ground, getting away safely. Again, fighters returning to their base safely. Let's just do it one more time because it's our show. So there's the first 𝐄𝐥𝐿. There's the second 𝐄𝐥𝐿. The fighters emerge from the tunnel as if it's easy to do. It's not. They have to get up, climb up out of the land. They have to not be seen. You'll notice that Qassam puts the good guys in green and the red triangles. So you see the good guys there in green. We'll see that throughout this. I mean, we've seen it throughout the war, but particularly there, the bad guys are red. That soldier, oblivious to what's going on, it's surely killed by the second 𝐄𝐥𝐿. You can see the distance from the back door. That's the perfect distance for maximum destruction from that device. The 𝐄𝐥𝐿 is a explosively formed penetrator that has been built by the Qassam brigades and developed over 25 years. There's something like 50 versions of them till they perfected to the point that they are now. And so that tunnel operation is really remarkable. And those kind of tunnel operations are why the IDF went from saying there was 500 kilometers of tunnels to 750 to 1,000. And in their nightmares, there's 2,000 kilometers of tunnels in their nightmares. So let's go to 38 for here tomorrow because there's more from Rafah. So you're watching here an elevated shooter. You can watch the Yasin warhead travel in this shot. If you watch the left side of the screen here, you can see it. Qassam's going to show it to you in a freeze frame. Okay, so here the fighter is these fighters are under a building. They're under a building, so they're below ground. They're climbing up the tunnel to the main floor, and then they're climbing the stairs in order to get an elevated firing position. It's this one where you can see the warhead. I mixed them up. You'll see the warhead flying through the air from the elevated position on this one. There it is there. Green for the good guys. Again, they point, they're green. So what you have is a three-dimensional attack here. Fighters who are down under the ground protected, coming up to the first floor to the surface level and passing on the surface level because it's more militarily effective to fire on an elevated firing position. So you're seeing Qassam in just this attack use 3 dimensions on the battlefield, something that we've talked about throughout this war that they do. They're able to move between buildings with the tunnel network that they have built. And especially in Rafah, in a place like that has been waiting for these months for this battle, they can use these tunnels and the destruction, like just look at the destruction, right? Rafah has been subjected to attack for this entire war, even though it's called in the BBC a safe zone or whatever. We all know it's not. Dr. Khaled talked about how it's not that, clearly not that. We'll let this one go one more time because you could watch just how significant it is. Military colleges will study this kind of warfare because we're watching fighters come from below ground and then end up above ground. And so you effectively are firing from the position of where an aircraft would be in terms of below surface level and firing from the air. And you can see the way the elevated firing position in this video, you can see how it provides you the angle to come down on top of the armored vehicle that is roughly hidden. That vehicle believes that that's a tank, that it believes that it's hidden behind that. And if they were firing from the ground level, it would be hidden. But they go from the tunnel, climb up, past the first floor, into the upper floors, and are firing from the upper floors. Here they're using the alleyways and ruins, which is something that they, of course, have always been doing in this battle. The Israelis' wanton destruction has no military purpose. It's military vandalism, and it makes it easier for the fighters to move. It gives them more concealment. It actually hides their tunnels because it's dropping the entire building down on top of the tunnel, which makes it difficult for Israel to go find the tunnel, which they basically stopped doing in December. Here, this video here, we're in the tunnel with the fighters. This is a fighter holding a detonator where he's going to detonate the tunnel entrance here. And he says, so then they detonate the entrance where the soldiers are, and they go down the tunnel, and they find, the fighter says, they sent their robots into the tunnel, and here it is in our hands. So what would happen if they sent their soldiers? So this is Qassam holding an explosive ordnance disposal robot, a bomb disposal robot that's supposed to deactivate explosives. You've probably seen them above ground. They often have guns on them that try to neutralize the explosion. Not sure what this one has. But detonating the tunnel entrance. So the tunnels are used for offensive reasons when they use it to climb the stairs to get to the top floor. They use it to pop out and put 𝐄𝐤𝐿 devices right beside a tank. And here they're using the tunnel to lure the Israeli force into the tunnel and blow up part of the tunnel. And the way the tunnel network works, it's like a spider web. So you block one, if you can turn an attack tunnel into a mass casualty event by blowing up a piece of the tunnel, but they have those thick, heavy doors that we've seen throughout the war. They close those heavy doors, and you're just blowing up one section of a spider web. You're not destroying the tunnel. So the tunnels can be used in these ways. The Israelis haven't even got to mapping this kind of thing yet. So we don't know for sure exactly how detailed it is, but we've watched them do these kind of attacks where they turn an offensive tunnel into a mass casualty by blowing up the entrance. And you don't lose that tunnel by blowing up the entrance because you have a spider web that you can access the other channels of the tunnel through various different ways, like a spider web. So that's Rafah. Rafah. There's more videos from today that we'll show you next week, but that's the last 3 days in Rafah. And those were pretty remarkable videos, even having covered these videos throughout the war. Those videos were remarkable. So we're going to move now to 𝐓𝐡𝐞. I organize these by area, by battalion. So this is 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in Gaza City that we're going to watch here. This is number 10. And you're going to see this fighter with his Yasin 105. And you can see written on his Yasin 105, it says, "For the soul of the martyr hero Sheikh Yasin, the founder of Hamas, who the weapon is named after." So that was a nice little touch, just written on his warhead. And you could see that this is 𝐓𝐡𝐞. If we'll remember, in February in 𝐓𝐡𝐞, the Israelis invaded, and that's where Soraya al-Quds repurposed an F-16 bomb that was dropped and didn't explode. And Soraya al-Quds rewired the bomb and blew up the Israelis, and they left. That fight was a 2-week fight that was fierce enough that we called it a battle. We called it the Battle of 𝐓𝐡𝐞, something that we don't hand out lightly, because it's very significant. And it was a battle, the Battle of 𝐓𝐡𝐞. The Israelis lost the first Battle of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 in November and December. They reinvaded in February and lost the Battle of 𝐓𝐡𝐞. And here they are for the past week fighting in 𝐓𝐡𝐞, and they pulled out today, surely with nothing accomplished besides more destruction and aimed at civilian targets. Their IDF field reports talk about 100 killed fighters, 20 killed fighters, 50 killed fighters, but it doesn't match anything that we're seeing. And the Israelis don't have the intelligence. They're not going and doing battle damage assessments and going to see if they killed 50 people. They're just throwing out these numbers, and that's how they end up with the fake numbers in the 10,000 fighters killed, which I think is an absurd number. I think you will find it's considerably lower than that, maybe even half that. So in 𝐓𝐡𝐞, there was a famous sniper operation that you guys probably saw on social media. It was a Al-Ghul. I mean, the Al-Ghul is a copy of an Iranian Syed or a Austrian Steyr 50 cal sniper rifle. We're watching him set his scope here. He's got camouflage gaffer tape to hide the barrel, so the barrel doesn't shine in the sunlight. He's using pillows, blankets, and a pile of rubble here for a direct hit. And we had to cut out, the soldiers being killed, but you can go to my Twitter account, and Tamara will probably throw that up on the banner at some point, and you can go and watch these videos. Tamara has expertly edited out the things that invoke censorship. So we want to keep this on. But that sniper hit the target. And the Israelis didn't say it was in this event, but the Israelis said in 𝐓𝐡𝐞 that Brigadier General Bar Sheshet was the most senior officer wounded in this war. He was the Nahal Brigade's chief's forward command team, and he was shot on Friday. And he's an interesting character because he was also in the ICJ, the South African case for the ICJ, because when he was fighting in this area in November, he said, whoever returns here, if they return here, will find scorched earth, no houses, no agriculture, no nothing. They have no future. So he was a genocidal intent guy. And he just gets one right here from Qassam sniper who got him directly. The footage shows the bullet passing through him, an armor-piercing incendiary bullet. There's multiple rounds for the Al-Ghul sniper rifle, for the 50 cal sniper rifle. There's armor-piercing, there's armor-piercing incendiary, and there's incendiary, and there's regular. And so it looks like what we saw here was an armor-piercing incendiary round used in. And it appears that what happens is it blows through his gun that he's holding there. It blows through the magazine of that gun, but you can see the exit of the bullet very clearly on that shot. So another sniper, another time Qassam is picking the highest commander in any of the group. And you can see, let's show it one more time tomorrow. Yeah. You can see the commander in this shot. Watch him talk to the other people. Watch. He's the one talking. Look at them looking back. He's the one talking. He's the commander. 𝐶𝐤𝐿 waits, picks him. He's moving. Snipers picking a moving target is an elite skill. They're now running, and he has cover of another soldier in front of him. And 𝐶𝐤𝐿 still got him. So those are hunter-killer teams working together. The spotter is the hunter, and the sniper is the killer. And then we also have the cameraman embedded in these units. And the cameraman embedded in the units is what gives 𝐶𝐤𝐿 the ability to show us these videos that show that Israel's lying and shows definitively that they're losing the war, which we've been saying all along, because their goals were impossible to achieve, and they will not be achieved. So after this sniper attack, 𝐶𝐤𝐿 put out a mixtape. So it's number 12 tomorrow. And tomorrow I had to do some skillful editing of this one because there's many kills. So the text says, sharp eye, calm breath, single shot, confirmed kill. That's the recipe of a sniper. And we remember these ones. If people have been following this show for the whole war, we've shown you every single one of these, literally. We've broken every single one of these operations down, sometimes at length. That mixtape is a lot better on my Twitter than it is on the YouTube with the censorship. And we want to keep it family friendly on the show. But again, you can see the skill of these fighters, multiple different shooters, multiple different barrel types. They're not all technically Al-Ghouls. Some of them are Sayad 50 cals. You can tell by some of the markings on them, but we call them all the same thing for simplicity and because that's what the fighters call them. And that's one of the things about being a fighter. You get to name your weapons. As we know, the Americans name all their weapons after indigenous nations and tribes that they fought against. And 𝐶𝐤𝐿 names them all after their leaders. This is named after Adnan al-Ghul. He is the father of the arms industry. He was the man who said, we need to get a weapon in every hand of every fighter, and that your military organization is only as large as armed fighters. So it doesn't matter if you have 70,000 soldiers. If all 70,000 don't have a gun, then they're not in your army. You need to have weapons in their hands. So Adnan al-Ghul did that. We've told some stories about Adnan al-Ghul over the course of these 8 months. He famously escaped Gaza in the first Intifada when he was wanted, and swam back into Gaza with a barrel of TNT to basically literally begin the arms industry in Gaza. We have one more from Zaytoun, this mortar barrage that... oh, no, this is a sniper. We'll skip the mortar barrage. This is a Soraya Al-Quds operation, Soraya Al-Quds sniper operation. They're going to use the same rifle you're going to see here. So that is a engineering team, an Israeli engineering team on the border, fixing the fence, probably fixing the breaches that 𝐶𝐤𝐿 and Soraya Al-Quds blew through the wall on October 7th. The 60 places that they breached the wall, they're constantly patching those back up throughout the course of the war. And you watch here how long the fighter, Soraya always gives us the longer cut. So you can see how long he calms his breath before firing to be in the most relaxed position. You can see, again, his rifle on a pillow, on rubble. These fighters are making do with what they have, and they're doing it very effectively. And it's created a situation for the Israelis where anywhere they are in Gaza, they're within reach, because Gaza is small enough that you can reach the soldiers when they're in these buffer zones. They're within reach if you have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance such that you can pick their positions And then you can move through tunnels, move through rubble, move through alleyways, move through protected areas that are your own neighborhood. You can get yourself into position, which is the most dangerous part of being a sniper, is to get into the location. And the second most dangerous is to exit the location after you fire. So you fire and you need to get out of there in case the radar has tracked your firing position. And I think we're seeing a medical evacuation here in Zaytun. So Israel wrapped up the battle in Zaytun today. They've left. Battle of Zaytun number 3 ended today. They left today. And so that's Gaza City. Now we're going to move to Jabaliya. Jabaliya is a famous place of resistance in Gaza. It is the place where the First Intifada began. It is one of the places where the armed struggle really took root. Although the First Intifada was a nonviolent action in large measure, it was also the real beginnings of the armed struggle. The armed struggle actually encouraged the civil disobedience of the First Intifada. And it happened in Jabaliya. So Jabaliya is something that is like 𝐄𝐥𝐿𝐵. It's a place that haunts the Israelis because when they used to have to patrol in Gaza, Jabaliya, the camp, the alleyways, the tight-knit community, the soldiers had a really hard time with Jabaliya, many casualties in Jabaliya. So the Israelis reinvaded Jabaliya last week, forcing, as Nora said, 150,000 people got evacuation notices from Jabaliya. And this is a place, Jabaliya, that the Israelis said that they had operational control of in November while they were burning the camp. We'll remember that was the first footage that we got from their TikTok videos where they started this campaign of burning buildings that now is so normal. But that started in Jabaliya. They burned the buildings. They massacred hundreds of people, we'll remember, to carry out a single strike on a battalion commander. The 𝐓𝐡𝐞 brigades lost their northern brigade commander, one of the top losses of their fighters in the war. And it has impacted the Jabaliya battalions. There's multiple battalions in Jabaliya. Apparently not at all, because let's get at number 7 here tomorrow, because as soon as they moved in, we had 𝐓𝐡𝐞 scrambled their air force. So 𝐓𝐡𝐞 sent their aerial bombers here. This is a quad. It's probably a hexacopter, quadcopter, hexacopter carrying munition, and it's positioning itself here over, you can see, over Namr troop carriers. And on the front left of a Namr troop carrier is a hatch. Let's see where this lands. Right on the front left hatch. So you can see that hatch on the other 2 vehicles. So their air force is precise. These are dropping a 𝐓𝐡 built hand grenade. Adnan Al-Ghul started the weapons program with hand grenades because that was the simplest thing to get in the hand of every fighter. If you build your own hand grenades and give them to your fighters, it's easier to have than guns at times. And so hand grenades were the first of 𝐓𝐡's weapons industry. And so you're seeing the beginning of the weapons industry and the realization of the weapons industry in this drone dropped munition. And again, just watch. It hits right on top, on the front left, right where the hatch would be. It's difficult to see, but if that hatch is open, that's a real problem. And the hatch would likely be open because they're not expecting drone dropped munitions on top of them, especially not at this point in the war when they believe that they've destroyed and pushed the fighters. They're telling their people they've won the war in Jabaliya, but here they are going back into Jabaliya to fight. So we've seen 𝐓𝐡 during these battles, just in the last 2 weeks, I've showed you 𝐓𝐡 capturing Israeli drones. We've seen them shooting down Israeli drones, multiple types of captured, multiple types of shot down. We've seen them deploy their own drones, 𝐓𝐡's own drones deployed for surveillance, And now we're seeing, again, I showed you a month or so ago, the drone drop munitions, because they've done this half a dozen times in the war. And critically, they did it on October 7th. Drone dropped munitions were a critical part of the blinding operation, as it's called, the operation on October 7th that knocked out the network connectivity that the Israelis depend on. And that was the first part of the operation. The rocket fire, the blinding operation, so Israelis didn't know what happened, then the breaching operation, all functioned together to allow the Qassam brigades to overrun the Gaza division at Riyam base within 40 minutes of the first moment of attack. It was completely overrun. Not that they arrived there, that they overran it. A base that's 15 kilometers travel from the border. So even the commute time is included in that. The footage of October 7th sacking of the Israeli bases is part of the reason why you hear people in Israel saying that they don't believe that the state can defend them anymore, because that was such a one-sided battle by Qassam special forces against a bunch of Israeli soldiers that didn't look like they were ready to hang with Qassam fighters, and the overrunning of those bases happened so fast. Let's look at number 8 here tomorrow. This is a Yasin strike against a tank that is right outside the door. That is right outside the door of that house. I'm not very good with feet, but it's not very many feet. It's pretty much as close to the building as you could get. These fighters are able to move through the buildings and get in position to hit the tank way closer than it can protect itself. And it's pointing in between the seam there underneath the turret of the tank. The triangle pointed to that because that's the destination for the warhead. And obviously they can't return fire because you can see where the tank barrels pointed the opposite direction. So they're not going to turn and return fire. So you've got another situation of a Qassam fighter carrying out an operation and returning to his base safely. So let's do number 9, because this is interesting. This is Qassam rocket teams. We don't do a lot of rocket stuff. And again, I apologize to the rocket guys because they do a lot of work. But when there's tons of videos, these are the ones that get cut out. But you can see them launching. They're using their iron peacemaker, peace enforcer device that we talked about on the show last week. You can see that's a Qassam-made rocket controller setting timers. And this is a rocket barrage from, wait for it, from Jabaliya, from where the IDF is operating, right underneath their nose. The tanks are all over there, and they see the rockets go over their head. And it's a psychological operation that the resistance does and has always done. This is just like a militant middle finger. It's not designed to be devastating. It's designed to send a message. It's to send a message that they can carry out these operations under actual occupation with the forces actually in Jabaliya. These are launches from Jabaliya, where an entire Israeli army division is operating, and they're firing rockets. And there was multiple examples of this. I wanted to bring you this one because it gives you a really good shot of the Iron Peacemaker, which is a play on words for the Iron Dome, essentially, that it defeats the Iron Dome by setting the timers on these rockets to set them at frequencies that can defeat the Iron Dome. That's the intention behind it. So sending a message in Jabaliya with rocket fire, which is just, again, you can't say that you're winning a war when the fighters are launching homemade rockets right under your nose, and the forces, and it's almost literally right under their noses, because the rocket flies over the head of the Israeli soldiers on the base and flies to the place that they live in Israel. So it's a very psychological, it's mostly a psychological operation, and we see it all the time. As soon as Israelis pulled out of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 today. I didn't see it, but you could go check the field reports. I bet you 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fired rockets the moment the Israelis, or as they were leaving, fire them over their head as they're driving away, as a sign, just as a sign that says we're still here. Of course, the rockets aren't just a sign. They can cause a lot of damage, and the development of the rocket program is very significant for the Palestinians. Of course, it was the also Adnan Al-Ghul to professionalize a rocket program, which is basically the next stage above mortars. Hand grenade, and then the mortar, and then the rocket. Those are the three logical weapons that you would start with for the type of battle that you fight when you're a besieged population and your enemy believes in iron walls and like watchtowers and fences. You need to traverse those to fight. Let's look at number 30 here, Tamara. Here we're going to see two cameras. There you see the green for the good guy again in 𝐤𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿's videos. The red is the Israeli. You're seeing two cameras for this Yasin strike on a Merkava tank, an elevated strike on a Merkava tank. So you're seeing it from multiple angles. So they're having the ability to get these videos shot from multiple positions. Now you're watching a fighter mouse hole, and as we've seen this all through the war as well. He's mouse holing through a building. He doesn't have to go outside. He comes out and he's going to step out into the street and be face to face with a tank. And you see clearly he hits it right underneath the turret, which is exactly where he's aiming for. So he mouse holes out of the building. So we see them use tunnels. And now we're seeing them watch with surveillance an Israeli sniper position in the building, knocking a big hole out of the wall, the opposite of what the 𝐤𝐿𝐴𝐻 snipers do. And that's a fragmentation warhead that he's firing there. So that's an anti-personnel warhead that when it hits the building, the shrapnel fragments explode. You can see it there. He's got another one there. He reloaded. We don't see that very often, seeing them actually reload on camera. But we see him reload there and fire that fragmentation grenade. So he's using the appropriate weapon against personnel in the building in Jabaliya, the place that was supposed to be defeated in November, are choosing which warhead to use in the appropriate situation. So they're not short of weaponry still 8 months on. And so these tiny little clues that we're seeing here are really all pile up to the reasons why Israel's losing this war. And it's not even close. There's not something they're going to find in Jabaliya that's going to turn this war. You can see him moving through these mouse holes are critical. So the tunnels under the ground, the mouse holes above the ground allow the fighters to move between these buildings and get the cameraman is showing you that he's going to go out on the street and hit that from the dead center of the tank. Another situation where a fighter stares down the barrel of a tank, which is obviously courageous, but it is also effective. He is going in and hitting that spot on the tank that is the weak spot on the tank. And so it's not just bravery. It is very much bravery, but it's also skill. It's not just a suicide mission to go and try and take out one vehicle. These fighters are returning to their bases as better fighters than they were when they went. So those are important things to acknowledge because that's the thing that Israel's going to have to confront. If Israel's plan is to occupy Gaza for an elongated period of time because they want, if they leave, they have to leave in defeat. So dragging out the war this way, these kind of the fighters returning to their base safely with the information and the knowledge and the experience, it's really valuable. Let's go to the next one tomorrow's 31. And here we go. A Yasin strike, again, staring down the barrel of a tank from an elevated firing position. difficult to see the result of that one, but the fighters using these elevated firing positions are happening all over. Then this guy and his cameraman are just down in the street, like 25 meters away from a Merkava tank, and it appeared they hit him with that. And this, just to point out, all of these Yassins that we're seeing, as I pointed out on a previous episode, Qassam noted that the cost of the entire Yassin anti-tank weapon program from 2005 to today amounts to $500 per round, per weapon, per round. That's all the research and development. That's all of the training, and that's all the putting it into service. And they're targeting with these $500 weapons a $6 million tank there, that even if you don't destroy the tank doesn't blow up in flames. The point of the Yassin is to penetrate the tank in a small spot. And then what the penetration of the tank fires like hot metal, molten shrapnel inside the tank, and it has nowhere to escape. So it ends up just being like bullets flying all through the tank. And that's the destruction it makes. So people looking for the tank to blow up like in a movie as the symbol of whether it's successful or the operation is effective, it's not the way that the weapon works. So you wouldn't see it blow up in that way. Although we have seen many burning. Sorry, was that 31 tomorrow? We're on 31, 32, 32. So this is 4 shooters. That's a Namr troop carrier. That shooter's getting within, I don't know, again, what is that? That's like basically across the street distance, moving through the rubble. That Israel sees that rubble and thinks that area is out of service. And then now that's a D9 armored bulldozer. Now they're using the alleyways of Jabaliya, the famous alleyways of Jabaliya. The alleyways of the camps all over Palestine are famous for their resistance and the way the resistance uses it, from Jenin in the north to Rafah in the south. It's the same in all the camps, and that's why the Israelis are always losing. They're losing in Nur Shams, they're losing in Jenin, they're losing in the alleyways of Rafah. We're watching them here now, 20 minutes losing in the alleyways of Jabaliya, because the fighters know these alleyways like the back of their hands. It's their homes. For better or for worse. They're temporary homes, as they always point out. If you ask them, they're temporary homes, and they'll tell you where their actual home is in the Gaza envelope, as Israel calls it, that has been depopulated because of the Qassam attacks, and people have not moved back into those areas. Those are the areas where these fighters are from and their families are from, and they want to go back to those places. They consider Gaza a temporary place, but in the camps, they organize the camp like their old villages. And that's something probably people have watched this show know that that's the case, but they moved their villages into the camps and organized them in much the same way, named the streets the same way, named the areas the same way. But they believe that they're temporary. And then after this one, we'll go to 33. Now we're watching these fighters move through the alley with multiple rounds in their hands, and then all 3 of them come up in unison. So we're watching 2 shooters and a cameraman here. The one shooter's picking the armored personnel carrier and the Namr troop carrier, and the shooter on the right is choosing the tank in the foreground. And you can watch now, we're seeing the helmet cam of the shooter that's shooting for the Merkava. But we're going to let this loop one more time, because watching all 3 of them wander down the alley here, holding their 2 parts of their Yassin, and then watch them all pop up at the same time. boom. And you have to be tight when you're firing side by side like that. This is a skilled operation. I made light of the fact that they popped up all together, but popping up all together is how you efficiently get through the operation. If you don't send one guy up so that he gets picked off, you carry out the operation in sequence, in unison. And that's what we're seeing with that. Again, let's just go one more time on this one, because watch the graffiti in the alleyways here. You can see him holding the warhead. That's the Yasin warhead on the left there. They've stationed a camera here, and then you watch all three of them pop up, and you can see that each shooter picks his own target. They're picking both of those targets, and you can watch the trajectory of the flight and see that both did fire on their target. So that was in unison operation. Another remarkable, still in Jabaliya, where Israel said that they controlled in November. Just a joke. 34. Perfect. There's so many numbers on this one this week that we just want to make sure the logistics are all correct. Great job, Tamara, as usual. Again, this is just more alleys. These are the alleys of the First Intifada. These are the alleys of the resistance in the Gaza Strip. These are the alleys that drove the Israelis out of Gaza. In the First Intifada, the Israelis used to drive around in their trucks in the cities. Throughout the 90s, that stopped. By the 2000s, they were basically garrisoned on bases inside Gaza and couldn't move. They didn't move into the city areas at all unless it was an invasion. And the reason why they did that is because of the resistance in the alleys. So I wanted to bring all these alley shots to you because this is a critical point of the armed struggle in Palestine. And it is in every camp, and every camp is the same. They're all overcrowded, but they're intimate, and people know every nook and cranny, and the Israelis don't. So they don't stand a chance fighting indigenous fighters. Even though it's not their land, they're indigenous to the area. They know this land like the back of their hand, and the Israelis don't. Let's do number 35. And this is a tandem 85. We've talked about this before. This is a Yasin with a tandem 85. This is a Qassam designed weapon where they took a regular RPG warhead that was no longer as effective against the up-armored Israeli vehicles. So Qassam engineers attached a second charge to the 85 millimeter round. They attached a 60 millimeter front charge, so it becomes a tandem charge like the Yasin 105. But instead of getting rid of all of the, quote unquote, or let's say less useful RPG rounds, they turn it into a very effective round by adding a second charge to it. So this weapons industry that Qassam does, sometimes they copy weapons that are existing weapons and they perfect existing weapons, but many of the weapons are unique to Qassam. Nobody else makes a tandem charge thermobaric warhead. That is a Qassam invention. To make these 85 millimeter RPG rounds into tandem warheads is a Qassam invention. In many ways, the Shawaz, the way you see that Shawaz device that we saw, in many ways, that's a Qassam invention. It's using military technology and know-how that's been around since the First World War, shape charge, but Qassam has perfected the way that the system works and then made the device function perfectly. And that's what we're seeing. We don't see these Yassins backfiring. When he pulled the pin out of the Shawaz exploded and penetrated 650 millimeters of rolled armor, homogeneous armor. So the weapons work. Instead of using their engineering skills to try to make some, new fancy, they didn't. They perfected already existing weapons and applied the skill set to making the best versions of those weapons that already exist. So that's what we're seeing. This was identified as a thermobaric warhead, but it was actually just a Yasin 105. And you can see the two shooters. We'll let it go through one more time because I was yammering too much on that one. But you're going to see the shooters are going to come out to the walls here, and you're going to see that there's no wall. And the two shooters, like just the destruction all over in these videos is something that I just, this is just wanton destruction. There's no military purpose to smashing out the wall on the second floor of a building. And people are going to go home and live in these the day the Israelis pull out. The minute the Israelis pull out, people will go back and start brooming off their floors and moving the concrete and setting up their tents in those spots. So that is number 36. If that was number 36 tomorrow, let's move to Hezbollah. Sorry, there is one more. So this is the one that's identified as a thermobaric warhead, but I believe it's just Yasin 105. The thermobarics are usually painted beige, and they're the fuel air weapon that we saw used in Khan Yunis that makes a large fuel explosion. You're watching soldiers in a window still here, 8 months on. Israelis still hanging out in windows with their hammers. And then you see these two fighters here. One has a fragmentation warhead, and this is a Yasin 105 warhead. And so the Yasin 105 is fired first, blows the hole in the wall, and then the second shooter follows up with the fragmentation warhead. And the fragmentation warhead enters the room and explodes and sends shrapnel all around. It's for anti-personnel. So there's the hole being blown in the wall. And then the second shooter comes in with the fragmentation grenade, which is just proof that Qassam has intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance on all of these spots. They're making decisions about what weapon to use that is the most appropriate. And we're still seeing this. Not only are we seeing it, we're seeing more of it 8 months into the war. Now, I want to take a look at some Hezbollah operations. There was a bunch of them, and I didn't know how long to go, but I wanted to show you a couple of these. This is a double cornet. Hezbollah has made a Nasrallah, a twin anti-tank guided missile system. It's a twin cornet, and it is designed to defeat the Israeli active protection systems on their tanks that I was talking about before. The trophy system that sends out a missile to try to intercept the incoming missile. So you send these double, you can see the double cornet there. You send them out one after another in less than 1.5 seconds, and it's too fast for the Israeli tank to reload its trophy system. We're not seeing that used on a tank here, but like all of these Hezbollah operations, they're a sign of what can come. Israel has moved their tanks off the border in the north, as people I'm sure are aware at this point. There's a buffer zone of for soldiers, for armored vehicles of about 10 kilometers, sometimes even more, because they want to be out of range of this Cornet anti-tank missile fire. And so we're seeing these devices used against buildings, but they could be used against tanks, and they will be used against tanks if the war escalates. And we've seen Hezbollah put these double cornets and mount them on the back of like ATVs, like four-wheelers. And so they basically made like a miniature open light infantry vehicle that has anti-tank weapons attached to it. It's a pretty cool way to move around in the forested mountained hills of South Lebanon, a completely different military environment than the Gaza Strip, where if you had a device like that, it would just be blown up immediately because of the drone, because of the flat land. But Hezbollah is able to have these kind of devices because of the forest. Well, let's go to the next one, 22. This is a rocket launch system. This is a Fala 2. That's a Katyusha Grad rocket launcher. That's a 30 rocket launcher. And after this this is a symbol of what Hezbollah could do if the war opened up. The frequency, the speed, the caliber, the whole deal about these rocket systems, they flood the Iron Dome. And Israel even admitted after this attack that they only got 15. Iron Dome only got 15 of the rockets. We're watching more than 40 be fired. Nasrallah said in a speech the other day, he said that there's 200,000 people evacuated in the communities in the north, Israelis evacuated from the north. But he said, if we want this war to expand, we could make it 2 million in minutes, because they have rocket systems that will drive people out. These are rockets targeting the northernmost part of Israel. This is an attack on 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐿, the northernmost part of Israel. But as Nasrallah said, they can go from 𝐄𝐥𝐿 to Eilat in the south. And if the war opens up, if Israelis are talking about opening up a war, their entire state is going to be within rocket fire. And just a note about this as well, you can see this is footage of the fires in 𝐄𝐥𝐿. The Israeli government yesterday notified the hotels where the people who have evacuated their communities in the north are living. The government told those hotels that they should expect to continue hosting people until the end, at least through the end of 2024. So the Israelis don't see a scenario where they're going to have their people move back to the north. So we're seeing the strategic depth of Israel be restricted. There's the fires from the rocket attacks, burning non-native trees that were planted by the Israelis famously, that burn like tinder. So the Israeli government said that, announced quietly to the hotels that they should expect to be hosting people for the rest of the year. And school starts in September in Israel. And so the school year is not going to start. The country is going to be 10 kilometers smaller than it was on October 6th. There's no indication that they're rebuilding the Gaza envelope anytime soon. That war in Gaza is dragging on too. And so we have an Israel that's considerably smaller than it was on October 6th. And its strategic depth is really in question. And that has been one outcome of this war. Let's look at 23 tomorrow. This is Hezbollah versus an Iron Dome system. And I've been following these, just try to bring you some of these same attacks to show you how we've been tracking them throughout this war. I showed you a few weeks ago them targeting the Iron Dome system in the same place, Beit Hillel. This is guarding a base of the IDF's 91st Division, which has soldiers included from the Golani Brigade and command posts. And we see footage. They're going to show us footage here of the Iron Dome interceptor site. There, you see it there. The 4 launchers for the site, and then they're going to show us some Israeli footage of the Iron Domes being launched. So they're actually, so there you go. There's the outgoing Iron Dome system, and so they're showing you that they know they have this surveillance, like literally from the ground. And now we're seeing them rigging up an Ababil Qasif attack drone, a one-way loitering. Some people call them suicide drones, kamikaze drones, one-way attack drones, loitering munitions. It's a fiberglass drone. We've talked about them a number of times. It makes that buzzing lawnmower noise. And it's fiberglass, it's propeller, it has a low heat signature, it flies below the radar and hits, as you can see there, because the Iron Dome can't catch it. Because of the heat signature and because of the height that it flies at, and it's able to hit precisely with a small warhead, but big enough to do damage to these sites. And now they're hitting these Iron Dome platforms regularly. And there's only a dozen or so of these, unless there's some secret stash that nobody, including the Americans, don't know about. The Americans gave at the beginning of the war 2 Iron Domes that they had to Israel to help them, but we've now seen multiple be taken out here. So let's go to 24 tomorrow. Before, we don't need to go back around for this. Yeah, let's go to 24. This is a triple anti-tank guided missile strike, and it's interesting here. We're seeing an RPG-29, and you can see the fighter in his uniform moving through the terrain in Lebanon, and he's barely visible. His camo is, and you can see the RPG-29 hitting the corner there, and that's it looks like a Cornet. I think that might be a Concours. It's a similar anti-tank weapon to a Cornet. I think that was a Concours. But in any case, they have Cornets, Concours, RPG-29s, and that's an Almas. That's what I've been following. This is the weapon system that was captured by Hezbollah from the Israelis in the 2006 war. It was reverse engineered. It's a top attack anti-tank missile, which means it can be driven from a separate location, then it's fired, and you see it there go right through the grill of this car. And I queued up the next video. When this video ends tomorrow, you can just skip to it, because I queued it up in isolation because I wanted to show you the capability. And again, this is something that could be used on tanks, but we're watching it be used on network connectivity equipment, spying equipment, Israeli bases. That was the Jeep. I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out whose Jeep that was. Maybe it was one of the base commanders' Jeep. But let's watch it here. So you can see the beautiful spring in South Lebanon, and you can watch the trajectory of this. This Almas anti-tank guided missile is going to go inside a garage. If you're listening to the program, we're watching a camera on the missile fly over inside a garage and hit right through the grill of the car that they were aiming for. So we've been tracking this on this show. I bring these Almas in because it's a qualitative increase in capability of the resistance. And if the war were to break out in a more concentrated, or if the escalation ladder is to be climbed, all of these weapons will be deployed in different ways. Right now, they're shaping the battlefield with these weapons, but these weapons can be used to great effect in a ground war against Israeli tanks that are going to attempt, like they do every time, to cross the wadis and come up the mountains and fight uphill like Sun Tzu told you not to do. That's what the Israelis do. And now these increased weapons will make that even harder. And we know in 2006, it was a humiliating defeat for the Israelis. The Israelis spent most of the 2006 July war. Most of their fighting in that war was recovery. It was recovering troops that had gotten smoked, that were trapped, that were isolated, that needed to be saved by other units. And most of the logic of that war was other units coming to save the units that failed in their objectives to capture Bint Jbeil, famously, and required a 2-week battle just to extract the Israeli soldiers out of that situation. And that's when they called for a ceasefire. So that is the resistance report from the very southern tip of the Gaza Strip to the northern tip of the Gaza Strip to the northern tip of Israel from South Lebanon. And the resistance is just increasing at this point. And I think we're going to bring on everybody else at this point, and we are going to seamlessly go to Hasan Nasrallah's speech.
It's been such a range of emotions. Wow. Yeah, if we gave out our own awards, you would win.
There was so much
for today's show, MVP.
Yeah, there was so much there, John, and as you mentioned earlier, there's so much more that you couldn't cover this week. So
even while you were delivering the report, there was stuff coming in from Qassam in real time. So
and incredible.
Might have to do 2-a-week show.
Yeah. And so if people are wondering why we let you go on for more than an hour, it's because that was a compromise. Otherwise, you would have had to go on for 4 hours.
Yeah, there was talk of 4 hours. I saw it.
I know our audience would not say no to that. So, but yeah, let's talk about the Nasrallah speech. That was 2 nights ago. When Nasrallah speaks, the entire Arab world stops and listens. What was I watched a little bit of it. I didn't watch the whole thing, I admit, but maybe Ali, if you can talk a little bit about what he said in general, and then we can discuss.
Yes, it was one of these speeches, and I'm sorry I have a bit of a sore throat, so my voice sounds a little rough. But it was one of these speeches that he gave on, typically his speeches are on occasions commemorating, the martyrdom of a commander or a respected member of the resistance. And this was one such occasion. It was the martyrdom, I think the 7th anniversary of the martyrdom of a man called Mustafa Badruddin. But these occasions are used to make sort of broad speeches, give analysis. And this was, in some respects, similar to what we've heard before from Nasrallah, where he lays out sort of a broad regional vision, sort of weighs the balance of forces in the region. He was very confident. He sounded very self-assured. And I think some of the key takeaways is that he talked about how Israel and the United States are really in a strategic bind. I mean, one thing I'll say, a point he makes time and again, is that the United States is the one that calls the shots. It's not Israel. And I think that I agree with that. We've seen that in terms of this kind of this dance that the Biden administration is playing, where they try to make it appear as if they're reigning in Israel when they're not actually doing so. But aside from that, what Nasrallah says is that, Israel is really in a bind because it has 2 choices. One is to accede to the demands of the resistance in order to get a ceasefire, and those demands are well known. They include, of course, an end to the war, allowing people to return home, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, unfettered flow of aid and reconstruction, and of course, an exchange of prisoners. So that's one way, but that constitutes defeat for Israel, and that's unacceptable to Israel. On the other side, Israel has the choice to continue the war, a war of attrition, which it is clearly losing. And I think we could, just see from the presentation that Jon has just given us how severe that defeat is militarily. And just think about how little of that you see in the mainstream media. You never see the videos or the reports of the resistance that we just saw from Jon in the New York Times, on CNN, on the BBC. So people are unaware of the extent to which Israel is losing the war on the ground. And I say that to emphasize that Nasrallah's analysis is fact-based. It's grounded in the reality. And that's, of course, not just in Gaza, which he called the main front, but he also talked about Lebanon, which we've seen, where they have been gradually escalating the tactics and escalating the type of weapons they're using. And he also made reference to the fronts with the Iraqi resistance and Yemen. And so, again, that reminds us that the resistance looks at this as not a single battle, a single decisive battle which is going to defeat Israel, but a war over a period of time which Israel is losing, and the resistance feels confident that it's winning. So that's really what I took away from it. But I know there were other points that others might want to emphasize from the speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the October 6th versus October 7th reality, just he talked about how October 6th, there was no Palestinian state. They were ghettoized and ignored. And October 7th, because of heroic indigenous resistance that was built under blockade, and the resistance since then has completely has Israel in upheaval. It has them their military generals are being mocked. They don't believe that the people in their society don't believe that the army can take care of them anymore. The students are out. He talked about the student protesters. The students are out in the streets, inspired by the resistance and the courageous resistance of the fighters, but also of the people of Gaza who have been enduring through this, and everybody watches it and are inspired by, like what can we do? Like, people ask themselves, what can we do? Because you watch what people in Gaza are doing, and that has inspired people. Whereas the juxtaposition is the Israelis are just seen as, child killers who mock the international community. He Nasrallah noted a couple times of UN speeches where the Israeli UN ambassador held up that card and said, whatever the ceasefire address is Yahya Sinwar, and he held up the card for Sinwar, and Nasrallah was like, just watch that scene and tell me who's winning and who's losing the war. I think it's the same ambassador ripped up the UN charter and just.
He had a tiny little baby paper shredder, and
I thought when I saw the tiny little, it was Gilad Erdan.
Yeah.
When I saw the tiny little paper shredder, I thought, that phrase comes into your head: the world's tiniest violin.
Yeah.
So the world's tiniest paper shredder.
He mocked it. And everybody mocked it, and the world mocked it, right? Yeah. So Israel's shown itself to be this strategic. He pointed out, like, they're losing the war, so they're a strategic liability to the United States. The United States, the UK, all these countries have to come save them all the time. They have to air bridge all the weapons to them. They have to actually literally knock Iranian missiles out of the sky for them. And they're just a brutal state that insults the world, kills children. And their own people don't feel confident that their settler project can last. And he did that with the sort of classic Nasrallah Israeli media summary, right? Like he does the Israeli media roundup. And he says, just listen to what they say. Well, he says two things. Look at the battlefield results, but also look at what the enemy says. Look at what the defense minister says. Look at how they mock Netanyahu for saying that they just need Rafah for the complete victory. If we don't have Rafah, there's no complete victory. He's being mocked for that. They want the chief of staff Halevi to resign. There's protests in the streets constantly.
And if you well, I want to come back to that, but I just want to say more about the speech and then sort of pick up on something Nasrallah said and bring it up to date in a sense. But he also talked about the impotence of the Arab regimes. He was talking about Lebanon in particular, on the issue of Syrian refugees, where internally in Lebanon there's calls for the many Syrian refugees to go back home. And he says, they should be able to go back home, but they should be able to go back home safely. And what that means is that the Lebanese government should demand that the U.S. sanctions that prevent Syria from rebuilding, the so-called Caesar sanctions, should be lifted. And the way to pressure the West is to say, okay, so if you don't want them to go back home to Syria where they can actually live not under these brutal sanctions, then we're going to open the shores of Lebanon and let them sail to Europe. And he said they would immediately change their policy. But when you're a government that waits for a phone call from this or that Western embassy to tell you what to do, and you have no sovereignty, then you can't take decisions. You're not really the master of your own fate. And so that's a point that applies more broadly, because he's contrasting the sovereignty, in a sense, of the resistance axis, the fact that they are taking the decisive decisions about the future, about the destiny of their people in the region, as opposed to the Arab dictatorships that are lining up to help the United States and Israel shoot down missiles that are aimed at Israeli military bases, which is just absolutely extraordinary. But the point I wanted to pick up on, when Nasrallah talked about, the disarray within Israel, the defeatism, the confusion, look at what's happening just in the last few hours, where Netanyahu, the prime minister, and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, are in an open public battle over the future of Gaza. I mean, and again, they're assuming that they were going to be able to dictate the future of Gaza, which clearly they're not. But Gallant is saying we have to be very clear and say publicly that we will not install a military government in Gaza. That's to say, an Israeli military government in Gaza for the long term. And Netanyahu is saying, I'm not going to allow the Palestinian Authority back to Gaza, and I'm not going to allow Hamas to rule Gaza. But Gallant, presumably as the defense minister, is the one who is receiving the reports from the ground directly, and is therefore making the assessment that there's no way we can hold Gaza. There's no way we can govern Gaza. They can't even hold Jabaliya and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 6-7 months after they claimed they had cleared the resistance out of them. And so there is just this complete unraveling within Israel that is mirrored by the complete, I think, confusion in the United States, where on the one hand, the Biden administration keeps saying they don't want Israel to attack Rafah, or they want humanitarian aid to go in. But at the same time, today, the Washington Post reported that despite saying that they're delaying sending the 2,000-pound bombs, which presumably Israel already has big stockpiles of anyway, they're going ahead to send $1 billion worth of tank ammunition, tactical vehicles. That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a sign that a lot of their vehicles have been destroyed in Gaza, and other military equipment. And at the same time, the Rafah crossing has been closed now for how long? And that's just an absolute catastrophe for people in Gaza. And there's no talk of getting it open. Remember last week we talked about that flash in the pan American plan to put a mercenary company to run the Rafah crossing? Well, as John showed us today, the resistance is attacking and killing and injuring Israeli soldiers at the Rafah crossing. So which mercenary firm is going to go into that situation? Or which Arab puppet regime of the Americans is going to go into that situation? It's even reported that the Palestinian Authority, which is closely allied with Israel and the United States, of course, is refusing to go to the Rafah crossing. So it's to tie it back to what Nasrallah is saying, I think it's very clear that Israel continues to be able to carry out horrifying massacres, murder, destroy, kill, starve, attack hospitals, utter horrors, but it's losing the war. And, people will often scoff at that. But I looked up these figures today just because it's an analogy we hear about all the time. Vietnam's official count of how many civilians were killed during the American war is over 2 million. And more than 1 million fighters were killed. So that's 3 million people. And remember that the United States dropped, there's a study from Yale that was published a few years ago. The United States dropped 2,756,941 tons of bombs on Cambodia to try to defeat the Viet Cong, who had bases in Cambodia. And to put that in perspective, according to this study, so that's 2.8 million tons of bombs into Cambodia. The Allies dropped just over 2 million tons of bombs during all of World War II. And the United States still lost the American war in Vietnam. So this is what we have to remember, that in an insurgency, in a war of liberation, the enemy, the aggressor, the colonizer, the occupier, the representatives of Western savagery and barbarism will always kill more people among the indigenous and native people. We saw that with the French in Algeria. We saw it in South Africa too. It's always the case. And that's not to say we should be casual about this or we should be sanguine about it. Our hearts are torn every single day about the horror that is being visited on people in Gaza. Our friends, our family, our colleagues, we want this to stop now. But I say this because murdering civilians is not equal to victory. If it was, then the United States would have been the winner in Vietnam. The United States would have been the winner in Afghanistan. The United States would have been the winner in all its other losing wars. And Israel would have been the winner in its losing war in Lebanon. So this is the analytically, we have to make that shift and not allow, not allow anyone to say, to introduce this defeatist sense that, well, Israel is bombing and killing more, therefore it's winning. No, Israel is losing the war. Israel has lost the war.
Yeah, the biggest battle in Palestinian history, as he pointed out, Nasrallah pointed out, and Israel's losing. That there's no need for defeatism in the face of that. That is a paradigm shattering reality that we're living through right now, with brutal consequences on our friends and colleagues and everybody in Gaza. But the war is being won right now. Israelis admit it. The Americans admit it. The State Department admitted that there's no total victory, that that's not a possibility. These kind of concepts, total victory. So at some point, if Israel wants to get back its captives, it's going to have to end the war. And when you end the war, you lose it. And that's why when Netanyahu says we lose the war if we don't go into Rafah, he's saying we're losing the war. Otherwise, why do you have to go into Rafah if you're right? If you lose the war, if you don't go into Rafah, that means today you're losing the war.
Yeah.
So they're admitting that.
And they're saying that it's also an existential war.
Yes, they're
right?
losing
They
an
said
existential war.
If they lose, i.e. when they lose, it's the end of the Israeli project, which we talked about last week. But yeah, they're in a panic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the bit that you mentioned earlier, John, that really struck me about the Nasrallah speech. He always makes a point of, not addressing the Israeli media, but addressing the fact that he and Hezbollah generally have, keep a close eye on the enemy's media, and when that's the part that struck me, that he mentioned the consensus within the Israeli media, even if it's just a tacit consensus, as we've just mentioned, that that Israel has lost the war in Gaza. They've lost militarily. Even if it's the beginning of the end, that's what it is. It's a long ending.
And part of that, I mean, I think this is a point I may have made before, but, back in the 1990s, I remember Edward Said always used to lament. He would say how, Israel has all these centers at its universities and think tanks focused on Arab studies, and they study all these, they have all these experts looking at the Arab world through a microscope, and in the United States the same thing, whereas the Arab world didn't have a single center of Israel studies. And his point was, knowledge is power, and they were using their knowledge in order to defeat or to keep Arabs in a subjugated position. And now I think the opposite is true. It's generally true that I think we, being on the side of justice, being on the side of truth, have a far better and closer and more nuanced understanding of Israel and the way they think there, and their sort of internal disputes than they have of the Palestinians or the Arab world or those they would see as their enemies more generally.
Yeah.
They believe the crude stereotypes. They believe that Arabs are savages who aren't capable, who are just sort of brutish and unintelligent. And so they underestimate.
Yeah.
They underestimate
Something I've really noticed since the 7th of October is a lot of Israelis saying this. They have this phrase, we speak Arabic now. I mean, it's not new since the 7th of October, but they've been really emphasizing that. And what they're saying is that, you know, Arabs and Arabic are brutal savages, basically. And we understand their language, and their language that the only language they understand is violence and force and killings. But, you know, that's just yet another example of how they don't actually speak Arabic, as it were. Although, yes, they do have some people who speak Arabic, but they don't understand their enemy. They don't understand their enemy, even though they think they do.
Yeah. We need a lot of psychoanalysts to help us understand what we're seeing, for sure.
But I think just to wrap up on on the Nasrallah speech, but you know, what Nasrallah does is he paints a broad strategic picture, and that picture is that, you know, yes, you have to look at the battles, you have to get right down into the details, as Jon is helping us do, and that's very informative. But when you step back and look at the big picture and you see this as a war which is going to take years to reach its conclusion, the resistance is winning. I think that's the takeaway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope our victory doesn't take years. I hope it comes sooner.
Well, in a previous speech, I think it was the one before this one, or it might have been 2 speeches back, he said Israel is going away. He said, I can't tell you it's going to be months or a year, but, you know, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but I think he said it could be 5 or 10, something like that. So, I mean, but that gives a clue of the type of time frame they're looking at, and the type of time frame. And of course, they would be ready if it's 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, because everything we're seeing now, and again, it goes back to, you know, when Jon talks about Al-Ghul starting the armed struggle back in the 1990s and with very rudimentary, to get to this point was a project that took decades. And so these are people, the people planning the resistance, not just in Gaza, but across the region, are thinking in terms of decades. They're thinking in terms of, we are not going to see the liberation necessarily. We're probably going to be killed, but our children and grandchildren are. And that is a very, in a sense, optimistic vision. They believe that liberation will come. They believe that their grandchildren will be free of this occupation, this barbarism, and this savagery. And that's something that I think is important to really hold on to.
Thanks so much for that, Ali. Well, let's before we wrap up, let's look at the site and talk about some of the extraordinary features that we have from Gaza right now. It's just been, it's been quite a week. But we have some brand new features from some of our writers. Let's see. Let's look at some of them. Yeah, go ahead, Ali.
Oh, okay. Well, the one on the front banner there is by our colleague David Cronin at the top, and that is pointing to Germany making yet more deals with Israel, even after the World Court warned Germany to abide by all its obligations. Germany remains completely unrepentant. So that's worth reading. And earlier on, we don't need to look at it again, but it's also on the front page. I wrote about a court overturning the German ban on Dr. Hasan Nasrallah. And by the way, there may be a ban on me. I don't know, because the ban on Dr. Abu Sitta was issued when he arrived on April 12th in Germany for the conference, the Palestine conference, which the police raided and shut down. And the German press reported at the time that they were also considering bans against me. Since I didn't try to go to Germany, I don't know if there is a ban on me. I'm going to try and make inquiries to find out if it's possible to learn. But in any case, that's a story for another day. I may or may not be banned from Germany. We'll find out. And from the rest of the Schengen area. So I wasn't planning to travel there anyway. But our writers in Gaza, our dear friend and colleague Abu Bakr Abed, has a new story right there, Central Gaza being pushed beyond breaking point. Abu Bakr, we of course had him on last week, and it was a really difficult and wonderful conversation. For those who missed it, it's on our YouTube channel. Abu Bakr is just an incredible person, as are all of our writers in Gaza. If we go back to the front, we can see that there's also a piece by Susan Abul-Hawa, the novelist. She's US-based, but she was just in Gaza again, her second visit since this genocide began. And this piece is really incredible. It's uplifting. I mean, it's hard to find, we all want to be rooted in the reality, but be uplifted at the same time. And I think Susan really achieves that. So this is a wonderful piece as well. And let me just see if there's anything else we want to point out.
No, Ruwaida had
all these pieces, literally every one of them that is visible now is by our writers in Gaza. So remember them, share them, read them, put them on your social media, send them to friends and family, because I cannot describe the conditions our writers are working in. It's beyond description, and yet they're still doing it, because as we heard Dr. Khaled saying at the beginning, the main fear that people have in Gaza is that they will be forgotten, that the world will shut them out, turn away from them. So one way you can make sure that the world doesn't turn away from them is to share this writing with them. And then Nora, why don't you talk about things that we have on the podcast, either just published or coming up?
Yeah. Well, just published. Sorry. Let's see. I did an interview with a bunch of students. Sorry. It's been almost 3 hours. So we had a
Thank you, John. Just kidding. We loved every minute.
So we were able to again speak to. I think I talked about this last week, but I published a post with that interview that has a bunch of different links and background on the students and the encampments that are still up, and students are still fighting, obviously. And then coming up, Ali and I did an interview with Barbara Ransby, who's just a legendary historian, activist in Chicago, and we're going to be hopefully putting that out in the next couple of days. That was really wonderful. And she was part of the student movement in the 1980s at Columbia University against apartheid South Africa. She had some really important analysis to share with us about the connections between the student movements from the 60s to the 80s to now, and the level of state repression and violence, and university as a hedge fund. So it was phenomenal.
One thing she said that really struck me was she pointed out how the protests against apartheid South Africa on campuses, the encampments, they were called shanties. I remember them because that was the time I was in college. She said that they were never on the scale of what we're seeing now. Right. And I think that just really struck me, because we always sort of compare the Palestine movement to the South Africa movement. And we say, when will the Palestine movement reach the scale of the South Africa movement? And what she was actually saying is that this is actually way bigger in a way than the South Africa movement. And I think that's true, because I think we can romanticize things in the past, but I remember the shanties on campus, but for the most part, life went on as normal, and, it wasn't necessarily a national news story. So it was a very thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to share it all with you. And then, as always, we cut up these 3-hour-long live streams and put them into bite-sized pieces for people to share. So be sure to go to all of our YouTubes and Instagram and Twitter, and we'll be sharing everything there as usual. Go to our website, sign up for emails, YouTube, become a subscriber so you can get notified when we have new podcast episodes and live streams. And finally, Asa, let's hear from some of our audience members of the last few hours.
Yeah, just one quick point about the students. What Ali just said about the scale is really interesting. I think that I'm thinking of the slogan of that where there's occupation, there'll be resistance, and I think that we've seen kind of some differences between the policing here in the UK and of the student protests and the campuses in the US, where there's been this kind of extreme violence really deployed against the students, and that hasn't happened in the UK yet. And I think that, and actually the paradox there for the Israelis and for the pro-Israelis, the Zionists in government here, is that if they crack down on them hard, it's going to end up breeding more resistance, I think. And we kind of saw that, where they didn't crack down on them initially, and there actually, before there was student encampments in the US, there was a series of occupations on campuses here in the UK, but they actually, paradoxically, they didn't actually get that much media attention because there wasn't as big a crackdown against them. So, by cracking down against them and carrying on this violence, paradoxically is bringing more attention towards them.
I mean, that's usually how it goes, right? Like, yeah. It's
and also at the University of Amsterdam, there was a huge violent crackdown.
They brought in bulldozers to destroy the encampment,
and it only increased the protests.
Right.
Yeah,
and it only increased the protests.
Right. Well, we'll have lots more on the student intifada across the world, and of course, you can read all about it on electronicintifada.net. All right, let's look at some comments.
Okay, so we'll go through the countries today, places that viewers are watching from today. California. Hi from a Palestinian in Denmark. Hi. Toronto, Canada. Sydney, Australia. Now, this was at the beginning of the live stream, and it would have been...
It's almost 2 a.m.
2 a.m. Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The night owls in Australia.
Yeah. Calgary, Alberta, Switzerland, New York, Cambodia, Thailand, Texas, United Kingdom, Prynhawn o Aberystwyth. Good afternoon from Aberystwyth, South Wales. Stockholm, Sweden, New Jersey, Malaysia, the occupation. Salam alaikum from the occupation, from I assume from within occupied Palestine. Hello from China, Ireland. We always have viewers, lots of views from Ireland, Singapore, Netherlands, Atlanta, Georgia, Sweden, Washington DC, Portugal, Copenhagen, Switzerland. It goes on and on and on.
Fantastic.
And we're so pleased. We love you all, and it feels like a community, and we need that, because these are very, very tough days. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
they are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you especially to Tamara Nassar, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, making this go smoothly and beautifully with just expertise. Tamara, thank you. Jon, Ali, Asa, on behalf of everyone at the Electronic Intifada, thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.